Chapter 24 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Chapter 24. Treats on a very poor subject, but is a short one, and may be found of importance in this history. It was no unfit messenger of death who had disturbed the quiet of the matron's room. Her body was bent by age, her limbs trembled with palsy, her face, distorted into a mumbling leer, resembled more the grotesque shaping of some wild pencil than the work of nature's hand. Alas! how few of nature's faces are left alone to gladden us with their beauty! The cares and sorrows and hungerings of the world change them as they change hearts, and it is only when those passions sleep and have lost their hold for ever, that the troubled clouds pass off, and leave heaven's surface clear. It is a common thing for the countenances of the dead, even in that fixed and rigid state, to subside into the long-forgotten expression of sleeping infancy, and settle into the very look of early life. So calm, so peaceful, do they grow again, that those who knew them in their happy childhood kneel by the coffin's side in awe, and see the angel even upon earth. The old crone tottered along the passages and up the stairs, muttering some indistinct answers to the chiding of her companion. Being at length compelled to pause for breath, she gave the light into her hand, and remained behind to follow as she might, while the more nimble superior made her way to the room where the sick woman lay. It was a bare garret room, with a dim light burning at the farther end. There was another old woman watching by the bed. The parish apothecary's apprentice was standing by the fire, making a toothpick out of a quill. "Cold night, Mrs. Corney," said this young gentleman, as the matron entered.
"Very cold indeed, sir,"
replied the mistress in her most civil tones, and dropping a curtsey as she spoke.
"You should get better colds out of your contractors,"
said the apothecary's deputy, breaking a lump on the top of the fire with a rusty poker.
"These are not at all the sort of thing for a cold night."
"They're the port's choosing, sir," returned the matron. "The least they could do would be to keep us pretty warm, for our places are hard enough."
The conversation was here interrupted by a moan from the sick woman. "Oh!" said the young man, turning his face towards the bed, as if he had previously quite forgotten the patient. "It's all U.P. there, Mrs. Corney."
"It is it, sir?"
asked the matron.
"If she lasts a couple of hours, I shall be surprised,"
said the apothecary's apprentice, intent upon the toothpick's point.
"It's the break-up of the system altogether. Is she dozing, old lady?"
The attendant stooped over the bed to ascertain, and nodded in the affirmative.
"Then perhaps she'll go off in that way, if you don't make a row," said the young man. "Put the light on the floor. She won't see it there."
The attendant did as she was told, shaking her head meanwhile, to intimate that the woman would not die so easily. Having done so, she resumed her seat by the side of the other nurse, who had by this time returned. The mistress, with an expression of impatience, wrapped herself in her shawl, and sat at the foot of the bed. The apothecary's apprentice, having completed the manufacture of the toothpick, planted himself in front of the fire, and made good use of it, for 10 minutes or so, when, apparently growing rather dull, he wished Mrs. Corney joy of her job, and took himself off on tiptoe. When they had sat in silence for some time, the two old women rose from the bed, and crouching over the fire, held out their withered hands to catch the heat. The flame threw a ghastly light on their shrivelled faces, and made their ugliness appear terrible, as, in this position, they began to converse in a low voice.
"Did she say any more, Annie dear, while I was gone?" inquired the messenger. "Not a word," replied the other. "She plucked and tore at her arms for a little time, but I held her hands, and she soon dropped off. She hasn't much strength in her, so I easily kept her quiet. I ain't so weak for an old woman, although I am on parish allowance. No, no." "Did she drink the hot wine the doctor said she was to have?" demanded the first. "I tried to get it down," rejoined the other, "but her teeth were tight set, and she clenched the mug so hard that it was as much as I could do to get it back again. So I drank it, and it did me good."
Looking cautiously round, to ascertain that they were not overheard, the two hags cowered nearer to the fire, and chuckled heartily.
"I mind the time," said the first speaker, "when she would have done the same, and made rare fun of it afterwards." "Ay, that she would," rejoined the other. "She had a merry heart. A many, many beautiful corpses she laid out, as nice and neat as waxwork. My old eyes have seen 'em. Ay, and those old hands touched 'em too, for I have helped her scores of times."
Stretching forth her trembling fingers as she spoke, the old creature shook them exultingly before her face, and fumbling in her pocket, brought out an old-time discoloured tin snuff-box, from which she shook a few grains into the outstretched palm of her companion, and a few more into her own. While they were thus employed, the matron, who had been impatiently watching until the dying woman should awaken from her stupor, joined them by the fire, and sharply asked how long she was to wait.
"Not long, mistress," replied the second woman, looking up into her face. "We have none of us long to wait for death. Patience, patience. He'll be here soon enough for us all."
"Hold your tongue, you doting idiot," said the matron sternly. "You, Martha, tell me, has she been in this way before?"
"Often,"
answered the first woman.
"But will never be again,"
added the second one.
"That is, she'll never wake again but once. And mind, mistress, that won't be for long."
"Long or short," said the matron snappishly, "she won't find me here when she does wake. Take care, both of you, how you worry me again for nothing. It's no part of my duty to see all the old women in the house die, and I won't. That's more. Mind that, you impudent old harridans. If you make a fool of me again, I'll soon cure you, I warrant you." She was bouncing away, when a cry from the two women, who had turned towards the bed, caused her to look round. The patient had raised herself upright, and was stretching her arms towards them.
"Who's that?"
she cried in a hollow voice.
"Hush, hush,"
said one of the women, stooping over her.
"Lie down, lie down." "I'll never lie down again, alive,"
said the woman, struggling.
"I will tell her. Come here, nearer. Let me whisper in your ear."
She clutched the matron by the arm, and forcing her into a chair by the bedside, was about to speak, when looking round, she caught sight of the two old women bending forward in the attitude of eager listeners.
"Turn them away," said the woman drowsily. "Make haste, make haste."
The two old crones, chiming in together, began pouring out many piteous lamentations that the poor dear was too far gone to know her best friends, and were uttering sundry protestations that they would never leave her, when the superior pushed them from the room, closed the door, and returned to the bedside. On being excluded, the old ladies changed their tone, and cried through the keyhole that old Sally was drunk, which indeed was not unlikely, since, in addition to a moderate dose of opium prescribed by the apothecary, she was labouring under the effects of a final taste of gin and water, which had been privily administered, in the openness of their hearts, by the worthy old ladies themselves.
"Now, listen to me,"
said the dying woman aloud, as if making a great effort to revive one latent spark of energy.
"In this very room, in this very bed, I once nursed a pretty young creetur that was brought into the house with her feet cut and bruised with walking, and all soiled with dust and blood. She gave birth to a boy, and died. Let me think. What was the year again?"
"Never mind the year," said the impatient auditor. "What about her?"
"I,"
murmured the sick woman, relapsing into her former drowsy state.
"What about her? What about? I know,"
she cried, jumping fiercely up, her face flushed and her eyes starting from her head.
"I robbed her.
So I did. She wasn't cold. I tell you she wasn't cold when I stole it." "Stole what, for God's sake?" cried the matron, with a gesture as if she would call for help. "It,"
replied the woman, laying her hand over the other's mouth.
"the only thing she had. She wanted clothes to keep her warm and food to eat, but she had kept it safe and had it in her bosom. It was gold, I tell you, rich gold, that might have saved her life."
"Gold?" echoed the matron, bending eagerly over the woman as she fell back.
Go on, go on. Yes, what of it? Who was the mother? When was it?"
"She charged me to keep it safe,"
replied the woman with a groan,
"and trusted me as the only woman about her. I stole it in my heart when she first showed it me, hanging around her neck, and the child's death, perhaps, is on me besides. They would have treated him better if they had known it all."
"Known what?" asked the other. "Speak."
"The boy grew so like his mother,"
said the woman, rambling on, and not heeding the question,
"that I could never forget it when I saw his face. Poor girl, poor girl! She was so young, too. Such a gentle lamb. Wait, there's more to tell. I've not told you all, have I?"
"No, no," replied the matron, inclining her head to catch the words, as they came more faintly from the dying woman.
"Be quick, or it may be too late."
"The mother,"
said the woman, making a more violent effort than before,
"the mother, when the pains of death first came upon her, whispered in my ear that if her baby was born alive and thrived, the day might come when it would not feel so much disgraced to hear its poor young mother named. And oh, kind heaven," she said, folding her thin hands together, "whether it be boy or girl, raise up some friends for it in this troubled world, and take pity upon a lonely, desolate child, abandoned to its mercy."
"The boy's name?" demanded the matron.
"They called him Oliver," replied the woman feebly. "The gold I stole was—"
"Yes, yes, what?"
cried the other. She was bending eagerly over the woman to hear her reply, but drew back instinctively, as she once again rose slowly and stiffly into a sitting posture, then clutching the coverlet with both hands, muttered some indistinct sounds in her throat, and fell lifeless on the bed.
"Stone dead," said one of the old women, hurrying in as soon as the door was opened. "And nothing to tell after all," rejoined the matron, walking carelessly away. The two crones, to all appearance, too busily occupied in the preparations for their dreadful duties to make any reply, were left alone, hovering about the body. Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 25. Wherein this history reverts to Mr. Fagin and Company. While these things were passing in the country workhouse, Mr. Fagin sat in the old den, the same from which Oliver had been removed by the girl, brooding over a dull smoky fire. He held a pair of bellows upon his knee, with which he had apparently been endeavouring to rouse it into more cheerful action; but he had fallen into deep thought, and with his arms folded on them, and his chin resting on his thumbs, fixed his eyes abstractedly on the rusty bars. At a table behind him sat the Artful Dodger, Master Charles Bates, and Mr. Chitling, all intent upon a game of whist; the Artful taking dummy against Master Bates and Mr. Chitling. The countenance of the first named gentleman, peculiarly intelligent at all times,
acquired great additional interest from his close observance of the game, and his attentive perusal of Mr. Chitling's hand, upon which, from time to time, as occasion served, he bestowed a variety of earnest glances, wisely regulating his own play by the result of his observations upon his neighbours' cards. It being a cold night, the Dodger wore his hat, as indeed was often his custom within doors. He also sustained a clay pipe between his teeth, which he only removed for a brief space when he deemed it necessary to apply for refreshment to a quart pot upon the table, which stood ready filled with gin and water for the accommodation of the company. Master Bates was also attentive to the play, but being of a more excitable nature than his accomplished friend, it was observable that he more frequently applied himself to the gin and water, and moreover indulged in many jests and irrelevant remarks, all highly unbecoming a scientific rubber. Indeed, the Artful, presuming upon their close attachment, more than once took occasion to reason gravely with his companion upon these improprieties, all of which remonstrances Master Bates received in extremely good part, merely requesting his friend to be blowed, or to insert his head in a sack, or replying with some other neatly turned witticism of a similar kind, the happy application of which excited considerable admiration in the mind of Mr. Chitling. It was remarkable that the latter gentleman and his partner invariably lost, and that the circumstance, so far from angering Master Bates, appeared to afford him the highest amusement, inasmuch as he laughed most uproariously at the end of every deal, and protested that he had never seen such a jolly game in all his born days.
"That's 2 doubles and the rub," said Mr. Chitling, with a very long face, as he drew half a crown from his waistcoat pocket. "I never see such a feller as you, Jack. You win everything, even when we've good cards. Charley and I can't make nothing of 'em."
Either the master or the manner of this remark, which was made very ruefully, delighted Charley Bates so much that his consequent shout of laughter roused the Jew from his reverie, and induced him to inquire what was the matter.
"Matter, Fagin!" cried Charley. "I wish you had watched the play. Tommy Chitling hasn't won a point, and I went partners with him against the Artful and Dumb."
"Aye, aye,"
said the Jew with a grin, which sufficiently demonstrated that he was at no loss to understand the reason.
"Try him again, Tom. Try him again."
"No more of it for me, thank'ee, Fagin," replied Mr. Chitling. "I've had enough. That here Dodger has such a run of luck that there's no standing agin him."
"My dear," replied the Jew, "you must get up very early in the morning to win against the Dodger."
"Morning," said Charley Bates. "You must put your boots on overnight, and have a telescope at each eye, and an opera glass between your shoulders, if you want to come over him."
Mr. Dawkins received these handsome compliments with much philosophy, and offered to cut any gentleman in company for the first picture card at 1 shilling at a time. Nobody accepting the challenge, and his pipe being by this time smoked out, he proceeded to amuse himself by sketching a ground plan of Newgate on the table with a piece of chalk, which had served him in lieu of counters, whistling meantime with peculiar shrillness.
"How precious dull you are, Tommy,"
said the Dodger, stopping short when there had been a long silence, and addressing Mr. Chitling.
"What do you think he's thinking of, Fagin?"
"How should I know, my dear?"
replied the Jew, looking round as he plied the bellows.
"About his losses, maybe? Or the little retirement in the country that he's just left, eh? Is that it, my dear?"
"Not a bit of it,"
replied the Dodger, stopping the subject of discourse as Mr. Chitling was about to reply.
"What do you say, Charley?" "I should say," replied Master Bates with a grin, "that he was uncommon sweet upon Betsy. See how he's a-blushing. Oh, my eye, here's a merry-go-rounder. Tom Chitling's in love. Oh, Fagin, Fagin, what a spree!"
Thoroughly overpowered with the notion of Mr. Chitling being the victim of the tender passion, Master Bates threw himself back in his chair with such violence that he lost his balance and pitched over upon the floor, where, the accident abating nothing of his merriment, he lay at full length until his laugh was over, when he resumed his former position, and began another laugh.
"Never mind him, my dear,"
said the Jew, winking at Mr. Dawkins, and giving Master Bates a reproving tap with the nozzle of the bellows.
"Betsy's a fine girl. Stick up to her, Tom. Stick up to her."
"What I mean to say, Fagin," replied Mr. Chitling, very red in the face, "is that isn't anything to anybody here."
"No more it is,"
replied the Jew.
"Charley will talk. Don't mind him, my dear. Don't mind him. Betsy's a fine girl. Do as she bids you, Tom, and you will make your fortune."
"So I do as she bids me," replied Mr. Chitling. "I shouldn't have been milled if it hadn't been for her advice. But it turned out a good job for you, didn't it, Fagin? And what's 6 weeks of it? He must come, some time or another, and why not in the winter time, when you don't want to go out a-walking so much, eh, Fagin?"
"Ah, to be sure, my dear,"
replied the Jew.
"You wouldn't mind it again, Tom, would you?" asked the Dodger, winking upon Charley and the Jew, "if Bet was all right?" "I mean to say that I shouldn't," replied Tom angrily. "There now! Ah! Who'll say as much as that, I should like to know, eh, Fagin?"
"Nobody, my dear," replied the Jew. "Not a soul, Tom. I don't know one of 'em that would do it besides you. Not one of 'em, my dear."
"I might have got clear off, if I'd split upon her, mightn't I, Fagin?" angrily pursued the poor half-witted dupe. "A word from me would have done it, wouldn't it, Fagin?"
"To be sure it would, my dear,"
replied the Jew.
"But I didn't blab it, did I, Fagin?" demanded Tom, pouring question upon question with great volubility.
"No, no, to be sure," replied the Jew. "You were too stout-hearted for that. A deal too stout, my dear."
"Perhaps I was," rejoined Tom, looking round. "And if I was, what's to laugh at in that, eh, Fagin?"
The Jew, perceiving that Mr. Chitling was considerably roused, hastened to assure him that nobody was laughing, and to prove the gravity of the company, appealed to Master Bates, the principal offender. But, unfortunately, Charley, in opening his mouth to reply that he was never more serious in his life, was unable to prevent the escape of such a violent roar, that the abused Mr. Chitling, without any preliminary ceremonies, rushed across the room, and aimed a blow at the offender, who, being skilled in evading pursuit, ducked to avoid it, and chose his time so well that it lighted on the chest of the merry old gentleman, and caused him to stagger to the wall, where he stood panting for breath, while Mr. Chitling looked on in intense dismay. "Hark!" cried the Dodger at this moment. "I hear the tinkler." Catching up the light, he crept softly upstairs. The bell was rung again, with some impatience, while the party were in darkness. After a short pause, the Dodger reappeared, and whispered Fagin mysteriously.
"What?"
cried the Jew.
"Alone?"
The Dodger nodded in the affirmative, and, shading the flame of the candle with his hand, gave Charley Bates a private intimation, in dumb show, that he had better not be funny just then. Having performed this friendly office, he fixed his eyes on the Jew's face, and awaited his directions. The old man bit his yellow fingers, and meditated for some seconds, his face working with agitation the while, as if he dreaded something, and feared to know the worst. At length he raised his head.
"Where is he?"
he asked. The Dodger pointed to the floor above, and made a gesture as if to leave the room.
"Yes," said the Jew, answering the mute inquiry. "Bring him down. Hush! Quiet, Charley. Gently, Tom. Scarce, scarce."
This brief direction to Charley Bates and his recent antagonist was softly and immediately obeyed. There was no sound of their whereabout when the Dodger descended the stairs, bearing the light in his hand, and followed by a man in a coarse smock frock, who, after casting a hurried glance round the room, pulled off a large wrapper which had concealed the lower portion of his face, and disclosed, all haggard, unwashed, and unshorn, the features of Flash Toby Crackit.
"How are you, Fagy?"
said this worthy, nodding to the Jew.
"Pop that shawl away in my castor, Dodger, so that I may know where to find it when I cut. That's the time of day. You'll be a fine young cracksman afore the old file now."
With these words, he pulled up the smock-frock, and, winding it round his middle, drew a chair to the fire, and placed his feet upon the hob.
"See there, Fagin," he said, pointing disconsolately to his top-boots. "Not a drop of Day and Martin since you know when. Not a bubble of blacking, by Jove! But don't look at me in that way, man. All in good time. I can't talk about business till I've eat and drank; so produce the sustenance, and let's have a quiet fill out for the first time these 3 days." The Jew motioned to the Dodger to place what eatables there were upon the table, and seating himself opposite the housebreaker, waited his leisure. To judge from appearances, Toby was by no means in a hurry to open the conversation. At first, the Jew contented himself with patiently watching his countenance, as if to gain from its expression some clue to the intelligence he brought, but in vain. He looked tired and worn, but there was the same complacent repose upon his features that they always wore, and through dirt, and beard, and whisker, there still shone unimpaired the self-satisfied smirk of Flash Toby Crackit. Then the Jew, in an agony of impatience, watched every morsel he put into his mouth, pacing up and down the room, meanwhile in irrepressible excitement. It was all of no use. Toby continued to eat with the utmost outward indifference, until he could eat no more. Then, ordering the Dodger out, he closed the door, mixed a glass of spirits and water, and composed himself for talking.
"First and foremost, Fagin," said Toby. "Yes, yes," interposed the Jew, drawing up his chair. Mr. Crackit stopped to take a draught of spirits and water, and to declare that the gin was excellent. Then placing his feet against the low mantelpiece, so as to bring his boots to about the level of his eye, he quietly resumed. "First and foremost, Fagin," said the housebreaker, "how's Bill?" "What?" screamed the Jew, starting from his seat. "Why, you don't mean to say—" began Toby, turning pale. "Mean!" cried the Jew, stamping furiously on the ground. "Where are they? Sikes and the boy! Where are they? Where have they been? Where are they hiding? Why have they not been here?" "The crack failed," said Toby faintly. "I know it," replied the Jew, tearing a newspaper from his pocket and pointing to it. "What more?" "They fired and hit the boy. We cut over the fields at the back, with him between us, straight as the crow flies, through hedge and ditch. They gave chase. Damn! The whole country was awake, and the dogs upon us." "The boy!" "Bill had him on his back, and scudded like the wind. We stopped to take him between us. His head hung down, and he was cold. They were close upon our heels, every man for himself, and each from the gallows. We parted company, and left the youngster lying in a ditch. Alive or dead, that's all I know about him." The Jew stopped to hear no more, but uttering a loud yell, and twining his hands in his hair, rushed from the room, and from the house. Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 26. In which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things, inseparable from this history, are done and performed. The old man had gained the street corner before he began to recover the effect of Toby Crackit's intelligence. He had relaxed nothing of his unusual speed, but was still pressing onward in the same wild and disordered manner, when the sudden dashing past of a carriage, and a boisterous cry from the foot-passengers who saw his danger, drove him back upon the pavement. Avoiding, as much as was possible, all the main streets, and skulking only through the byways and alleys, he at length emerged on Snow Hill. Here he walked even faster than before, nor did he linger until he had again turned into a court, when, as if conscious that he was now in his proper element, he fell into his usual shuffling pace, and seemed to breathe more freely. Near to the spot on which Snow Hill and Holborn Hill meet, opens, upon the right hand as you come out of the city,
a narrow and dismal alley leading to Saffron Hill. In its filthy shops are exposed for sale huge bunches of second-hand silk handkerchiefs of all sizes and patterns, for here reside the traders who purchase them from the pickpockets. Hundreds of these handkerchiefs hang dangling from pegs outside the windows, or flaunting from the door-posts, and the shelves within are piled with them. Confined as the limits of Field Lane are, it has its barber, its coffee-shop, its beer-shop, and its fried-fish warehouse. It is a commercial colony of itself, the emporium of petty larceny, visited at early morning, and setting in of dusk, by silent merchants who traffic in dark back parlours, and who go as strangely as they come. Here the clothesman, the shoe-vamper, and the rag merchant display their goods, as signboards to the petty thief. Here stores of old iron and bones, and heaps of mildewy fragments of woollen stuff and linen, rust and rot in the grimy cellars. It was into this place that the Jew turned. He was well known to the sallow denizens of the lane, for such of them as were on the look-out to buy or sell, nodded familiarly as he passed along. He replied to their salutations in the same way, but bestowed no closer recognition until he reached the further end of the alley, when he stopped to address a salesman of small stature, who had squeezed as much of his person into a child's chair as the chair would hold, and was smoking a pipe at his warehouse door.
"Why, the sight of you, Mr. Fagin, would cure the hoptalmy," said this respectable trader, in acknowledgment of the Jew's inquiry after his health.
"The neighbourhood was a little too hot, Lively," said Fagin, elevating his eyebrows and crossing his hands upon his shoulders.
"Well, I've heard that complaints of it once or twice before," replied the trader, "but it soon cools down again. Don't you find it so?"
Fagin nodded in the affirmative. Pointing in the direction of Saffron Hill, he inquired whether any one was up yonder to-night.
"At the Cripples?"
inquired the man. The Jew nodded.
"Let me see," pursued the merchant, reflecting. "Yes, there's half a dozen of 'em gone in, that I knows. I don't think your friend's there."
"Sikes is not, I suppose?" inquired the Jew with a disappointed countenance.
"Non is ventus, as the lawyers say," replied the little man, shaking his head and looking amazingly sly. "Have you got anything in my line to-night?"
"Nothing to-night," said the Jew, turning away.
"Are you going up to the Cripples, Fagin?" cried the little man, calling after him. "Stop! I don't mind if I have a drop there with you."
But as the Jew, looking back, waved his hand to intimate that he preferred being alone, and, moreover, as the little man could not very easily disengage himself from the chair, the sign of the Cripples was, for a time, bereft of the advantage of Mr. Lively's presence. By the time he had got upon his legs, the Jew had disappeared; so Mr. Lively, after ineffectually standing on tiptoe, in the hope of catching sight of him, again forced himself into the little chair, and, exchanging a shake of the head with a lady in the opposite shop, in which doubt and mistrust were plainly mingled, resumed his pipe with a grave demeanour. The Three Cripples, or rather the Cripples, which was the sign by which the establishment was familiarly known to its patrons, was the public-house in which Mr. Sikes and his dog have already figured. Merely making a sign to a man at the bar, Fagin walked straight upstairs, and opening the door of a room, and softly insinuating himself into the chamber, looked anxiously about, shading his eyes with his hand, as if in search of some particular person. The room was illuminated by 2 gas-lights, the glare of which was prevented by the barred shutters and closely drawn curtains of faded red from being visible outside. The ceiling was blackened, to prevent its colour from being injured by the flaring of the lamps, and the place was so full of dense tobacco smoke that at first it was scarcely possible to discern anything more. By degrees, however, as some of it cleared away through the open door, an assemblage of heads, as confused as the noises that greeted the ear, might be made out, and as the eye grew more accustomed to the scene, the spectator gradually became aware of the presence of a numerous company, male and female, crowded round a long table, at the upper end of which sat a chairman with a hammer of office in his hand, while a professional gentleman with a bluish nose, and his face tied up for the benefit of a toothache, presided at a jingling piano in a remote corner. As Fagin stepped softly in, the professional gentleman, running over the keys by way of prelude, occasioned a general cry of order for a song, which having subsided, a young lady proceeded to entertain the company with a ballad in 4 verses, between each of which the accompanist played the melody all through, as loud as he could. When this was over, the chairman made a sentiment, after which the professional gentleman on the chairman's right and left volunteered a duet, and sang it, with great applause. It was curious to observe some faces which stood out prominently from among the group. There was the chairman himself, the landlord of the house, a coarse, rough, heavy-built fellow, who, while the songs were proceeding, rolled his eyes hither and thither, and, seeming to give himself up to joviality, had an eye for everything that was done, and an ear for everything that was said, and sharp ones too. Near him were the singers, receiving with professional indifference the compliments of the company, and applying themselves in turn to a dozen proffered glasses of spirits and water, tendered by their more boisterous admirers, whose countenances, expressive of almost every vice in almost every grade, irresistibly attracted the attention by their very repulsiveness. Cunning, ferocity, and drunkenness in all its stages were there, in their strongest aspect; and women, some with the last lingering tinge of their early freshness almost fading as you looked, others with every mark and stamp of their sex utterly beaten out, and presenting but one loathsome blank of profligacy and crime; some mere girls, others but young women, and none past the prime of life, formed the darkest and saddest portion of this dreary picture. Fagin, troubled by no grave emotions, looked eagerly from face to face while these proceedings were in progress, but apparently without meeting that of which he was in search. Succeeding at length in catching the eye of the man who occupied the chair, he beckoned to him slightly, and left the room as quietly as he had entered it.
"What can I do for you, Mr. Fagin?" inquired the man, as he followed him out to the landing. "Won't you join us? They'll be delighted, every one of 'em."
The Jew shook his head impatiently, and said in a whisper,
"Is he here?"
"No," replied the man.
"And no news of Barney?"
inquired Fagin. "None," replied the landlord of the Cripples, for it was he. "He won't stir till it's all safe. Depend on it, they're on the scent down there, and that if he moved, he'd blow upon the thing at once. He's all right enough, Barney is, else I should have heard of him. I'll pound it, that Barney's managing properly. Let him alone for that."
"Will he be here tonight?"
asked the Jew, laying the same emphasis on the pronoun as before.
"Monks, do you mean?" inquired the landlord, hesitating.
"Hush!"
said the Jew.
"Yes."
"Certain,"
replied the man, drawing a gold watch from his fob.
"I expect him here before now. If you'll wait 10 minutes, he'll be—"
"No, no,"
said the Jew hastily, as though, however desirous he might be to see the person in question, he was nevertheless relieved by his absence.
"Tell him I came here to see him, and that he must come to me tonight. No, say tomorrow. As he is not here, tomorrow will be time enough."
"Good," said the man. "Nothing more?"
"Not a word now,"
said the Jew, descending the stairs.
"I say,"
said the other, looking over the rails and speaking in a hoarse whisper,
"what a time this would be for a sell! I've got Phil Barker here, so drunk that a boy might take him."
"Ah, but it's not Phil Barker's time,"
said the Jew, looking up.
"Phil has something more to do before we can afford to part with him. So go back to the company, my dear, and tell them to lead merry lives while they last."
The landlord reciprocated the old man's laugh, and returned to his guests. The Jew was no sooner alone, than his countenance resumed its former expression of anxiety and thought. After a brief reflection, he called a hack cabriolet, and bade the man drive towards Bethnal Green. He dismissed him within some quarter of a mile of Mr. Sikes's residence, and performed the short remainder of the distance on foot.
"Now,"
muttered the Jew as he knocked at the door,
"if there is any deep play here, I shall have it out of you, my girl, cunning as you are."
She was in her room, the woman said. Fagin crept softly upstairs, and entered it without any previous ceremony. The girl was alone, lying with her head upon the table, and her hair straggling over it.
"She has been drinking,"
thought the Jew coolly,
"or perhaps she is only miserable."
The old man turned to close the door, as he made this reflection. The noise thus occasioned roused the girl. She eyed his crafty face narrowly, as she inquired to his recital of Toby Crackit's story. When it was concluded, she sank into her former attitude, but spoke not a word. She pushed the candle impatiently away, and once or twice, as she feverishly changed her position, shuffled her feet upon the ground, but this was all. During the silence, the Jew looked restlessly about the room, as if to assure himself that there were no appearances of Sikes having covertly returned. Apparently satisfied with his inspection, he coughed twice or thrice, and made as many efforts to open a conversation, but the girl heeded him no more than if he had been made of stone. At length he made another attempt, and rubbing his hands together, said in his most conciliatory tone,
"And where should you think Bill was now, my dear?"
The girl moaned out some half-intelligible reply that she could not tell, and seemed, from the smothered noise that escaped her, to be crying.
"And the boy, too?"
said the Jew, straining his eyes to catch a glimpse of her face.
"Poor little child, left in a ditch, Nance. Only think."
"The child," said the girl, suddenly looking up, "is better where he is than among us; and if no harm comes to Bill from it, I hope he lies dead in the ditch, and that his young bones may rot there."
"What?"
cried the Jew in amazement.
"I do," returned the girl, meeting his gaze. "I should be glad to have him away from my eyes, and to know that the worst is over. I can't bear to have him about me. The sight of him turns me against myself and all of you."
"Pooh!" said the Jew scornfully. "You're drunk."
"Am I?" cried the girl bitterly. "It's no fault of yours if I am not. You'd never have me anything else, if you had your will, except now. The humour doesn't suit you, does it?"
"No,"
rejoined the Jew furiously,
"it does not."
"Change it, then," responded the girl with a laugh.
"Change it!"
exclaimed the Jew, exasperated beyond all bounds by his companion's unexpected obstinacy, and the vexation of the night.
"I will change it. Listen to me, you drab. Listen to me, who with 6 words can strangle Sikes as surely as if I had his bull's throat between my fingers now. If he comes back, and leaves the boy behind him, if he gets off free, and dead or alive fails to restore him to me, murder him yourself if you would have him escape, Jack Ketch. And do it the moment he sets foot in this room, or mind me, it'll be too late."
"What is all this?" cried the girl involuntarily.
"What is it?"
pursued Fagin, mad with rage.
"When the boy's worth hundreds of pounds to me, am I to lose what chance threw me in the way of getting safely through the whims of a drunken gang that I could whistle away the lives of? And me bound, too, to a born devil that only wants the will, and has the power to...
Panting for breath, the old man stammered for a word, and in that instant checked the torrent of his wrath, and changed his whole demeanour. A moment before, his clenched hands had grasped the air, his eyes had dilated, and his face grown livid with passion. But now he shrunk into a chair, and, cowering together, trembled with the apprehension of having himself disclosed some hidden villainy. After a short silence, he ventured to look around at his companion. He appeared somewhat reassured on beholding her in the same listless attitude from which he had first roused her.
"Nancy, dear," croaked the Jew in his usual voice, "did you mind me, dear?"
"Don't worry me now, Fagin," replied the girl, raising her head languidly. "If Bill has not done it this time, he will another. He has done many a good job for you, and will do many more when he can, and when he can't, he won't. So no more about that."
"Regarding this boy, my dear,"
said the Jew, rubbing the palms of his hands nervously together.
"The boy must take his chance with the rest," interrupted Nancy hastily. "And I say again, I hope he is dead, and out of harm's way, and out of yours. That is, if Bill comes to no harm. And if Toby got clear off, Bill's pretty sure to be safe, for Bill's worth two of Toby any time."
"And about what I was saying, my dear,"
observed the Jew, keeping his glistening eye steadily upon her.
"You must say it all over again, if it's anything you want me to do," rejoined Nancy. "And if it is, you had better wait till to-morrow. You put me up for a minute, but now I'm stupid again."
Fagin put several other questions, all with the same drift of ascertaining whether the girl had profited by his unguarded hints; but she answered them so readily, and was withal so utterly unmoved by his searching looks, that his original impression of her being more than a trifle in liquor was confirmed. Nancy, indeed, was not exempt from a failing which is very common among the Jew's female pupils, and in which, in their tenderer years, they were rather encouraged than checked. Her disordered appearance, and a wholesale perfume of Geneva which pervaded the apartment, afforded strong confirmatory evidence of the justice of the Jew's supposition; and when, after indulging in the temporary display of violence above described, she subsided, first into dullness, and afterwards into a compound of feelings, under the influence of which she shed tears one minute, and in the next gave utterance to various exclamations of "never say die," and divers calculations as to what might be the amount of the odds, so long as a lady or gentleman was happy. Mr. Fagin, who had had considerable experience of such matters in his time, saw with great satisfaction that she was very far gone indeed. Having eased his mind by this discovery, and having accomplished his twofold object of imparting to the girl what he had, that night, heard, and of ascertaining with his own eyes that Sikes had not returned, Mr. Fagin again turned his face homeward, leaving his young friend asleep with her head upon the table. It was within an hour of midnight. The weather being dark and piercing cold, he had no great temptation to loiter. The sharp wind that scoured the streets seemed to have cleared them of passengers, as of dust and mud, for few people were abroad, and they were to all appearance hastening fast home. It blew from the right quarter for the Jew, however, and straight before it he went, trembling and shivering as every fresh gust drove him rudely on his way. He had reached the corner of his own street, and was already fumbling in his pocket for the door-key, when a dark figure emerged from a projecting entrance which lay in deep shadow, and, crossing the road, glided up to him unperceived.
"Fagin,"
whispered a voice close to his ear.
"Ah," said the Jew, turning quickly round. "Is that—"
"Yes," interrupted the stranger. "I have been lingering here these 2 hours. Where the devil have you been?"
"On your business, my dear,"
replied the Jew, glancing uneasily at his companion, and slackening his pace as he spoke.
"On your business all night?"
"Oh, of course,"
said the stranger with a sneer.
"Well, and what's come of it?"
"Nothing good,"
said the Jew.
"Nothing bad, I hope?"
said the stranger, stopping short, and turning a startled look on his companion. The Jew shook his head, and was about to reply, when the stranger, interrupting him, motioned to the house before which they had by this time arrived, remarking that he had better say what he had got to say under cover, for his blood was chilled with standing about so long, and the wind blew through him. Fagin looked as if he could have willingly excused himself from taking home a visitor at that unseasonable hour, and indeed muttered something about having no fire; but his companion repeating his request in a peremptory manner, he unlocked the door, and requested him to close it softly while he got a light.
"It's as dark as the grave," said the man, groping forward a few steps. "Make haste."
"Shut the door,"
whispered Fagin from the end of the passage. As he spoke, it closed with a loud noise.
"That wasn't my doing,"
said the other man, feeling his way.
"The wind blew it to, or it shut of its own accord. One or the other. Look sharp with the light, or I shall knock my brains out against something in this confounded hole."
Fagin stealthily descended the kitchen stairs. After a short absence, he returned with a lighted candle, and the intelligence that Toby Crackit was asleep in the back room below, and that the boys were in the front one. Beckoning the man to follow him, he led the way upstairs.
"We can say the few words we've got to say in here, my dear," said the Jew, throwing open a door on the first floor. "And as there are holes in the shutters, and we never show lights to our neighbours, we'll set the candle on the stairs. There."
With those words, the Jew, stooping down, placed the candle on an upper flight of stairs exactly opposite to the room door. This done, he led the way into the apartment, which was destitute of all movables save a broken arm-chair, and an old couch or sofa without covering, which stood behind the door. Upon this piece of furniture the stranger sat himself with the air of a weary man; and the Jew, drawing up the arm-chair opposite, they sat face to face. It was not quite dark; the door was partially open; and the candle outside threw a feeble reflection on the opposite wall. They conversed for some time in whispers, though nothing of the conversation was distinguishable beyond a few disjointed words here and there. A listener might easily have perceived that Fagin appeared to be defending himself against some remarks of the stranger, and that the latter was in a state of considerable irritation. They might have been talking, thus, for a quarter of an hour or more, when Monks, by which name the Jew had designated the strange man several times in the course of their colloquy, said, raising his voice a little,
"I tell you again, it was badly planned. Why not have kept him here among the rest, and made a sneaking, snivelling pickpocket of him at once?"
"Only hear him!"
exclaimed the Jew, shrugging his shoulders. "Why? Do you mean to say you couldn't have done it if you had chosen?" demanded Monks sternly. "Haven't you done it with other boys scores of times? If you had had patience for a 12-month at most, couldn't you have got him convicted, and sent safely out of the kingdom, perhaps for life?"
"Whose turn would that have served, my dear?"
inquired the Jew humbly.
"Mine,"
replied Monks.
"But not mine," said the Jew submissively. "He might have become of use to me. When there are two parties to a bargain, it is only reasonable that the interests of both should be consulted. Is it, my good friend?"
"What then?"
demanded Monks.
"I saw it was not easy to train him to the business," replied the Jew. "He was not like other boys in the same circumstances."
"Curse him, no," muttered the man, "or he would have been a thief long ago."
"I had no hold upon him to make him worse,"
pursued the Jew, anxiously watching the countenance of his companion.
"His hand was not in. I had nothing to frighten him with, which we always must have in the beginning, or we labour in vain. What could I do? Send him out with the Dodger and Charlie? We had enough of that at first, my dear. I trembled for us all."
"That was not my doing," observed Monks.
"No, no, my dear," renewed the Jew, "and I don't quarrel with it now, because, if it had never happened, you might never have clapped eyes on the boy to notice him, and so led to the discovery that it was him you were looking for. Well, I got him back for you by means of the girl, and then she begins to favour him."
"Throttle the girl,"
said Monks impatiently.
"Why, we can't afford to do that just now, my dear," replied the Jew, smiling. "And, besides, That sort of thing is not in our way, or one of these days I might be glad to have it done. I know what these girls are, Monks, well. As soon as the boy begins to harden, she'll care no more for him than for a block of wood. You want him made a thief? If he is alive, I can make him one from this time, and if, said the Jew, drawing nearer to the other, it's not likely, mind, but if the worst comes to the worst, and he is dead—"
"It's no fault of mine if he is," interposed the other man with a look of terror, and clasping the Jew's arm with trembling hands. "Mind that, Fagin. I had no hand in it. Anything but his death I told you from the first. I won't shed blood. It's always found out, and haunts a man besides. If they shot him dead, I was not the cause. Do you hear me? Fire this infernal den. What's that?" "What?" cried the Jew, grasping the coward round the body with both arms as he sprung to his feet. "Where?" "Yonder," replied the man, glaring at the opposite wall. "A shadow. I saw the shadow of a woman, in a cloak and bonnet, pass along the wainscot like a breath." The Jew released his hold, and they rushed tumultuously from the room. The candle, wasted by the draught, was standing where it had been placed. It showed them only the empty staircase, and their own white faces. They listened intently. A profound silence reigned throughout the house.
"It's your fancy,"
said the Jew, taking up the light, and turning to his companion.
"I'll swear I saw it," replied Monks, trembling. "It was bending forward when I saw it first, and when I spoke, it darted away."
The Jew glanced contemptuously at the pale face of his associate, and, telling him he could follow if he pleased, ascended the stairs. They looked into all the rooms. They were cold, bare, and empty. They descended into the passage, and thence into the cellars below. The green damp hung upon the low walls. The tracks of the snail and slug glistened in the light of the candle, but all was still as death.
"What do you think now?"
said the Jew, when they had regained the passage.
"Besides ourselves, there's not a creature in the house, except Toby and the boys, and they're safe enough. See here."
As a proof of the fact, the Jew drew forth 2 keys from his pocket, and explained that when he first went downstairs, he had locked them in, to prevent any intrusion on the conference. This accumulated testimony effectually staggered Mr. Monks. His protestations had gradually become less and less vehement, as they proceeded in their search without making any discovery; and now he gave vent to several very grim laughs, and confessed it could only have been his excited imagination. He declined any renewal of the conversation, however, for that night, suddenly remembering that it was past 1 o'clock; and so the amiable couple parted. Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 27. Atones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter, which deserted a lady most unceremoniously. As it would be by no means seemly in a humble author to keep so mighty a personage as a beadle waiting, with his back to the fire, and the skirts of his coat gathered up under his arms, until such time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him; and, as it would still less become his station, or his gallantry, to involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beadle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he had whispered sweet words, which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the bosom of maid or matron of whatsoever degree. The historian whose pen traces these words, trusting that he knows his place, and that he entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them that respect which their position demands, and to treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank, and, by consequence, great virtues, imperatively claim at his hands. Towards this end, indeed, he had purposed to introduce, in this place, a dissertation touching the divine right of beadles, and elucidative of the position that a beadle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-minded reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled, by want of time and space, to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity; on the arrival of which, he will be prepared to show that a beadle properly constituted, that is to say, a parochial beadle, attached to a parochial workhouse, and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is, in right and virtue of his office, possessed of all the excellences and best qualities of humanity; and that to none of those excellences can mere company's beadles, or court of law beadles, or even chapel of ease beadles, save the last, and they in a very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons, reweighed the sugar tongs, made a closer inspection of the milk pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture, down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, and had repeated each process full half a dozen times, before he began to think that it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking. As there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would be an innocent and virtuous way of spending the time, if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance at the interior of Mrs. Corney's chest of drawers. Having listened at the keyhole, to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspapers, speckled with dried lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction. Arriving in course of time at the right-hand corner drawer, in which was the key, and beholding therein a small padlocked box, which, being shaken, gave forth a pleasant sound, as if of the chinking of coin, Mr. Bumble returned with a stately walk to the fireplace, and, resuming his old attitude, said, with a grave and determined air, "I'll do it." He followed up this remarkable declaration by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog; and then he took a view of his legs in profile with much seeming pleasure and interest. He was still placidly engaged in this latter survey, when Mrs. Corney, hurrying into the room, threw herself in a breathless state on a chair by the fireside, and covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart, and gasped for breath. "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron, "what is this, ma'am? Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me. I'm on—" Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, broken bottles.
"Oh, Mr. Bumble!"
cried the lady, "I've been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, ma'am!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "Who has dared to—" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself with native majesty. "This is them wicious paupers."
"It's dreadful to think of,"
said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble.
"I can't help it,"
whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, soothingly. "A little of the wine?"
"Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't. Oh, the top shelf in the right-hand corner. Oh!" Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard, and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet, and, snatching a pint green-glass bottle from the shelf, thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents, and held it to the lady's lips. "Oh, I'm better now,"
said Mrs. Corney, falling back after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose.
"Peppermint!"
exclaimed Mrs. Corney, in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beadle as she spoke.
"Try it. There's a little something else in it."
Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty.
"It's very comforting,"
said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beadle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron, and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her.
"Nothing,"
replied Mrs. Corney.
"I'm a foolish, excitable, weak creetur."
"Not weak, ma'am," retorted Mr. Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creetur, Mrs. Corney?"
"We're all weak creeturs,"
said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beadle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards. By the expiration of that time, Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creeturs," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble.
"I can't help it,"
said Mrs. Corney, and she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, looking round. "Another room, and this, ma'am, would be a complete thing."
"It would be too much for one,"
murmured the lady. "But not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble in soft accents. "Eh, Mrs. Corney?" Mrs. Corney drooped her head, when the beadle said this. The beadle drooped his, to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away, and released her hand to get at her pocket-handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allows you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beadle, affectionately pressing her hand.
"And candles,"
replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and house rent free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feelings. She sank into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse to-night, my fascinator?"
"Yes,"
replied Mrs. Corney bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctor says," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He is the master of this establishment. His death will cause a vacancy. That vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What an opportunity for a jining of hearts and housekeepings!" said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. "The one little word, my blessed Corney?"
Yes,"
sighed out the matron. "One more," pursued the beadle. "Compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off?" Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length, summoning up courage, she threw her arms around Mr. Bumble's neck, and said it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was a irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemnly ratified in another teacupful of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's decease. "Very good," said that gentleman, sipping his peppermint. "I'll call at Sowerberry's as I go home, and tell him to send to-morrow morning. Was it that as frightened you, love?"
"It wasn't anything particular, dear,"
said the lady evasively. "It must have been something, love," urged Mr. Bumble. "Won't you tell your own B?"
"Not now,"
rejoined the lady.
"One of these days. After we're married, dear."
"After we're married!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "It wasn't any impudence from any of them male paupers as—"
"No, no, love,"
interposed the lady hastily. "If I thought it was," continued Mr. Bumble, "if I thought as any one of 'em had dared to lift his wulgar eyes to that lovely countenance—"
They wouldn't have dared to do it, love," responded the lady.
"They had better not," said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. "Let me see any man, porochial or extra-porochial, as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that he wouldn't do it a second time."
Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have seemed no very high compliment to the lady's charms; but, as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat with many warlike gestures, she was much touched with this proof of his devotion, and protested, with great admiration, that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat-collar, and put on his cocked hat, and having exchanged a long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing for a few minutes in the male paupers' ward to abuse them a little, with the view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart, and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shutting up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but attracting no attention, and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlour at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward; and when he saw what was going forward, he was not a little surprised. The cloth was laid for supper. The table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter-pot, and a wine-bottle. At the upper end of the table, Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy chair, with his legs thrown over one of the arms, an open clasp-knife in one hand, and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close beside him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated. These symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties in cases of internal fever could have sufficiently accounted.
"Here's a delicious fat one, Noah, dear," said Charlotte. "Try him, do. Only this one."
"What a delicious thing is an oyster," remarked Mr. Claypole, after he had swallowed it. "What a pity it is! A number of 'em should ever make you feel uncomfortable, isn't it, Charlotte?"
"It's quite a cruelty,"
said Charlotte. "So it is," acquiesced Mr. Claypole. "Ain't you fond of oysters?"
"Not over much,"
replied Charlotte.
"I like to see you eat 'em, Noah, dear, better than eating 'em myself."
"Lor!" said Noah reflectively. "How queer!"
"Have another,"
said Charlotte.
"Here's one with such a beautiful delicate beard."
"I can't manage any more," said Noah. "I'm very sorry. Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss you." "What?" said Mr. Bumble, bursting into the room. "Say that again, sir."
Charlotte uttered a scream, and hid her face in her apron. Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position than suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beadle in drunken terror.
"Say it again, you wile, audacious fellow," said Mr. Bumble. "How dare you mention such a thing, sir? And how dare you encourage him, you insolent minx?" "Kiss her!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble in strong indignation. "Faugh! I didn't mean to do it," said Noah, blubbering. "She's always a-kissing of me, whether I like it or not."
"Oh, Noah!"
cried Charlotte reproachfully. "You are, you know you are," retorted Noah. "She's always a-doing of it, Mr. Bumble, sir. She chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of love." "Silence!" cried Mr. Bumble sternly. "Take yourself downstairs, ma'am. Noah, you shut up the shop. Say another word till your master comes home at your peril; and when he does come home, tell him that Mr. Bumble said he was to send a old woman's shell after breakfast to-morrow morning. Do you hear, sir?" "Kiss him!" cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands. The sin and wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country's ruined, and the character of the peasantry gone for ever." With these words, the beadle strode with a lofty and gloomy air from the undertaker's premises. And now that we have accompanied him so far on his road home, and have made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set on foot a few inquiries after young Oliver Twist, and ascertain whether he be still lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. Chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 28. Looks after Oliver, and proceeds with his adventures.
"Wolves tear your throats," muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. "I wish I was among some of you. You'd howl the hoarser for it."
As Sikes growled forth this imprecation with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee, and turned his head for an instant to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighbouring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction.
"Stop, you white-livered hound!"
cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead.
"Stop!"
The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead standstill, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol-shot, and Sikes was in no mood to be played with.
"Bear a hand with the boy," cried Sikes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. "Come back."
Toby made a show of returning, but ventured in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along.
"Quicker!"
cried Sikes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket.
"Don't play booty with me."
At this moment the noise grew louder. Sikes, again looking round, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them.
"It's all up, Bill!" cried Toby. "Drop the kid, and show 'em your heels."
With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look around, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge as if to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge which met it at right angles, and whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound, and was gone.
"Ho, ho, there!"
cried a tremulous voice in the rear.
"Pincher! Neptune! Come here! Come here!"
The dogs, who, in common with their masters, seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command. Three men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together.
"My advice, or leastways, I should say my orders, is," said the fattest man of the party, "that we immediately go home again."
"I'm agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles,"
said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face, and very polite, as frightened men frequently are.
"I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen," said the third, who had called the dogs back. "Mr. Giles ought to know." "Certainly," replied the shorter man. "And whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradict him. No, no, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation."
To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke.
"You're afraid, Brittles,"
said Mr. Giles.
"I an't,"
said Brittles.
"You are,"
said Giles.
"You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles."
said Brittles. "You're a lie, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. Now, these 4 retorts arose from Mr. Giles's taunt, and Mr. Giles's taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close most philosophically.
"I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen," said he. "We're all afraid."
"Speak for yourself, sir,"
said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party.
"So I do," replied the man. "It's natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances. I am." "So am I," said Brittles, "only there's no call to tell a man he is, so bounceably." These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who at once owned that he was afraid; upon which they all 3 faced about, and ran back again with the completest unanimity, until Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party, as was encumbered with the pitchfork, most handsomely insisted on stopping, to make an apology for his hastiness of speech.
"But it is wonderful," said Mr. Giles, when he had explained, "what a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd caught one of them rascals."
As the other 2 were impressed with a similar presentiment, and as their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament.
"I know what it was,"
said Mr. Giles.
"It was the gate."
"I shouldn't wonder if it was,"
exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea.
"You may depend upon it,"
said Giles, "that gate stopped the flow of the excitement. I felt all mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it." By a remarkable coincidence, the other 2 had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was quite obvious, therefore, that it was the gate; especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all 3 remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the 2 men who had surprised the burglars, and a travelling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse, and who had been roused, together with his 2 mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion. Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the 3 men hurried back to a tree behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up the light, they made the best of their way home at a good round trot; and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, the light might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways and low places were all mire and water. The damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by, with a hollow moaning. Still, Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing, as its first dull hue, the death of night, rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness, grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down, thick and fast, and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes; but Oliver felt it not, as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length, a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side. The bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture. When he had done so, he looked feebly round for help, and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint, from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but, shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there, he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man; but he kept up, nevertheless, and, with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now hosts of bewildering and confused ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears; and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as on the previous day; and as shadowy people passed them, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly he started back at the report of firearms. There rose into the air loud cries and shouts; lights gleamed before his eyes; all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions, there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping almost mechanically between the bars of gates, or through the hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road. Here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him; and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than in the lonely open fields. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew nearer to this house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall! On the grass inside he had fallen on his knees last night, and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place, that, for the instant, he forgot the agony of his wound, and thought only of flight. Flight! He could scarcely stand. And if he were in full possession of all the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, whither could he fly? He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked, and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and, his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that about this time, Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves, after the fatigues and terrors of the night, with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles's habit to admit to too great familiarity the humbler servants, towards whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But death, fires, and burglary make all men equals; so Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while with his right he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his bearers, but especially the cook and housemaid who were of the party, listened with breathless interest.
"It was about 2:30, said Mr. Giles, "or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3 when I woke up, and turning round in my bed, as it might be so." Here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair, and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to imitate bedclothes. "I fancied I heerd a noise." At this point of the narrative, the cook turned pale, and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear. "Heerd a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I says at first, 'This is illusion,' and was composing myself off to sleep, when I heerd the noise again, distinct." "What sort of a noise?" asked the cook. "A kind of a busting noise," replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. "More like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg grater," suggested Brittles. "It was when you heerd it, sir," rejoined Mr. Giles; "but at this time it had a busting sound." I turned down the clothes," continued Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, "sat up in bed, and listened." The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated "Lor!" and drew their chairs closer together. "I heerd it now, quite apparent," resumed Mr. Giles. "Somebody," I says, "is forcing of a door or window. What's to be done? I'll call up that poor lad, Brittles, and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat," I says, "may be cut from his right ear to his left, without his ever knowing it." Here all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker, and stared at him with his mouth wide open, and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. "I tossed off the clothes," said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth, and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, "got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of—" "Ladies present, Mr. Giles," murmured the tinker. "Of shoes, sir," said Giles, turning upon him, and laying great emphasis on the word. "Seized a loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. 'Brittles,' I says, when I had woke him, 'don't be frightened.' 'So you did,' observed Brittles in a low voice. 'We're dead men, I think, Brittles,' I says," continued Giles. "But don't be frightened." "Was he frightened?" asked the cook. "Not a bit of it," replied Mr. Giles. "He was as firm—pretty near as firm—as I was." "I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me," observed the housemaid. "You're a woman," retorted Brittles, plucking up a little. "Brittles is right," said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly. "From a woman, nothing else was to be expected. We, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittles' hob, and groped our way downstairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so." Mr. Giles had risen from his seat, and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut, to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed. "It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. "Open the door, somebody." Nobody moved. "It seems a strange sort of a thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning," said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself. "But the door must be opened. Do you hear? Somebody?" Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles; but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. "If Brittles would rather open the door in the presence of witnesses," said Mr. Giles, after a short silence, "I'm ready to make one." "So am I," said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms; and the party being somewhat reassured by the discovery, made on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs, with the dogs in front. The 2 women, who were afraid to stay below, brought up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud, to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers; and by a master stroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm, to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed. The group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable an object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes, and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Giles, valiantly pushing the tinker into the background. "What's the matter with the—Why, Brittles, look here!
Don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm—fortunately not the broken limb—lugged him straight into the hall, and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. "Here he is!" bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am! Here's a thief, miss! Wounded, miss! I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light." "In a lantern, miss," cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth, so that his voice might travel the better. The two women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber; and the tinker busied himself in endeavouring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion, there was heard a sweet female voice, which quelled it in an instant.
"Giles?"
whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Mr. Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him."
"Hush!" replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature much hurt?"
"Wounded desperate, miss," replied Giles with indescribable complacency.
"He looks as if he was a-going, miss," bawled Brittles in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should?" "Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the lady. "Wait quietly only one instant, while I speak to aunt."
With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away. She soon returned, with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony, and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and doctor.
"But won't you take one look at him first, miss?"
asked Mr. Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage that he had skilfully brought down.
"Not one little peep, miss?"
"Not now, for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake."
The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs with the care and solicitude of a woman. Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 29. Has an introductory account of the inmates of the house to which Oliver resorted. In a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast-table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some half-way between the sideboard and the breakfast-table, and, with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back, and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced, and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hung down by his side, grasping a waiter, looked like one who laboured under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision, in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat, in a stately manner, with her hands folded on the table before her. Her eyes, and age had dimmed but little of their brightness, were attentively upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and spring-time of womanhood, at that age when if ever angels be for God's good purpose enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17, cast in so slight and exquisite a mould, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eyes, and was stamped upon her noble head, seemed scarcely of her age, or of the world; and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humour, the thousand lights that played about the face, and left no shadow there, above all, the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were made for home and fireside peace and happiness. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table. Chancing to raise her eyes as the elder lady was regarding her, she playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on her forehead, and threw into her beaming look such an expression of affection and artless loveliness, that blessed spirits might have smiled to look upon her.
"And Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has he?" asked the old lady, after a pause. "An hour and 12 minutes, ma'am," replied Mr. Giles, referring to a silver watch, which he drew forth by a black ribbon. "He is always slow," remarked the old lady. "Brittles always was a slow boy, ma'am," replied the attendant; and seeing, by the by, that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. "He gets worse instead of better, I think," said the elder lady.
"It is very inexcusable in him, if he stops to play with any other boys," said the young lady, smiling.
Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging in a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman who ran straight up to the door, and who, getting quickly into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room, and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast table together.
"I never heard of such a thing!" exclaimed the fat gentleman. "My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of the night, too! I never heard of such a thing!"
With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and drawing up a chair, inquired how they found themselves.
"You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright," said the fat gentleman. "Why didn't you send? Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, and so would I, and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody, I'm sure, under such circumstances. Dear, dear, so unexpected! In the silence of the night, too!"
The doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected and attempted in the night time, as if it were the established custom of gentlemen in the housebreaking way to transact business at noon, and to make an appointment by post a day or two previous.
"And you, Miss Rose?"
said the doctor, turning to the young lady.
"Oh, very much so indeed," said Rose, interrupting him. "But there is a poor creature upstairs, whom aunt wishes you to see."
"Ah, to be sure," replied the doctor. "So there is. That was your handiwork, Giles, I understand."
Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red, and said that he had had that honour.
"Honour, eh?" said the doctor. "Well, I don't know. Perhaps it's as honourable to hit a thief in a back kitchen as hit your man at 12 paces. Fancy that he fired in the air, and you've fought a duel, Giles."
Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully that it was not for the like of him to judge about that, but he rather thought it was no joke to the opposite party.
"Gad, that's true," said the doctor. "Where is he? Show me the way. I'll look in again as I come down, Mrs. Maylie. That's the little window that he got in at, eh? Well, I couldn't have believed it."
Talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles upstairs; and while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed that Mr. Losberne, a surgeon in the neighbourhood, known through a circuit of 10 miles round as the doctor, had grown fat more from good humour than from good living, and was as kind and hearty, and withal as eccentric an old bachelor as will be found in 5 times that space by any explorer alive. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. A large flat box was fetched out of the gig, and a bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it was justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious and closed the door carefully.
"This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door, as if to keep it shut. "He is not in any danger, I hope?" said the old lady.
"Why,
"That would not be an extraordinary thing under the circumstances," replied the doctor, "though I don't think he is. Have you seen the thief?" "No," rejoined the old lady. "Nor heard anything about him?" "No." "I beg your pardon, ma'am," interposed Mr. Giles, "but I was going to tell you about him when Dr. Losberne came in." The fact was, that Mr. Giles had not, at first, been able to bring his mind to the avowal that he had only shot a boy. Such commendations had been bestowed upon his bravery, that he could not, for the life of him, help postponing the explanation for a few delicious minutes, during which he had flourished in the very zenith of a brief reputation for undaunted courage. "Rose wished to see the man," said Mrs. Maylie, "but I wouldn't hear of it." "Humph!" rejoined the doctor. "There's nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it is necessary," said the doctor. "At all events, I am quite sure that you would deeply regret not having done so, if you postponed it. He is perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose, will you permit me? Not the slightest fear. I pledge you my honour." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 30. Relates what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. With many loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arm through one of his, and offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, led them with much ceremony and stateliness upstairs. "Now," said the doctor, in a whisper, as he softly turned the handle of the bedroom door, "let us hear what you think of him. He has not been shaved very recently, but he don't look at all ferocious, notwithstanding. Stop, though. Let me first see that he is in visiting order." Stepping before them, he looked into the room. Motioning them to advance, he closed the door when they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bound and splintered up, was crossed upon his breast. His head reclined upon the other arm, which was half hidden by his long hair, as it streamed over the pillow. The honest gentleman held the curtain in his hand, and looked on, for a minute or so, in silence. Whilst he was watching the patient thus, the young lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face. As she stooped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred and smiled in his sleep, as though these marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of a love and affection he had never known. Thus a strain of gentle music, or the rippling of water in a silent place, or the odour of a flower, or the mention of a familiar word, will sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were, in this life, which vanish like a breath, which some brief memory of a happier existence, long gone by, would seem to have awakened, which no voluntary exertion of the mind can ever recall.
"What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers."
"Vice," said the surgeon, replacing the curtain. "Takes up her abode in many temples, and who can say that a fair outside shall not enshrine her?"
"But at so early an age,"
urged Rose. "My dear young lady," rejoined the surgeon mournfully, shaking his head, "crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims."
"But can you really believe that this delicate boy has been the voluntary associate of the worst outcasts of society?"
said Rose. The surgeon shook his head, in a manner which intimated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led the way into an adjoining apartment.
But even if he has been wicked," pursued Rose, "think how young he is. Think that he may never have known a mother's love, or the comfort of a home; that ill usage and blows, or the want of bread, may have driven him to herd with men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake, think of this before you let them drag this sick child to a prison, which in any case must be the grave of all his chances of amendment. Oh! as you love me, and know that I have never felt the want of parents in your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected with this poor child, have pity upon him before it is too late."
"My dear love," said the elderly lady, as she folded the weeping girl to her bosom, "do you think I would harm a hair of his head?"
"Oh, no," replied Rose eagerly.
"No, surely," said the old lady. "My days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I do to save him, sir?"
"Let me think, ma'am," said the doctor. "Let me think."
Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets, and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping and balancing himself on his toes, and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of "I've got it now," and "No, I haven't," and as many renewals of the walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt, and spoke as follows.
"I think, if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles and that little boy Brittles, I can manage it. Giles is a faithful fellow and an old servant, I know, but you can make it up to him in 1,000 ways, and reward him for being such a good shot besides. You don't object to that?"
"Unless there is some other way of preserving the child," replied Mrs. Maylie.
"There is no other," said the doctor. "No other. Take my word for it."
"Then my aunt invests you with full power," said Rose, smiling through her tears. "But pray, don't be harder upon the poor fellows than is indispensably necessary."
"You seem to think," retorted the doctor, "that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted to-day, except yourself, Miss Rose. I only hope, for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in as vulnerable and soft-hearted a mood by the first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion; and I wish I were a young fellow, that I might avail myself on the spot of such a favourable opportunity for doing so, as the present."
"You are as great a boy as poor Brittles himself," returned Rose, blushing.
"Well," said the doctor, laughing heartily, "that is no very difficult matter. But to return to this boy. The great point of our agreement is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I dare say; and although I have told that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that he mustn't be moved or spoken to, on peril of his life, I think we may converse with him without danger. Now, I make this stipulation: that I shall examine him, in your presence; and that, if from what he says, we judge, and I can show to the satisfaction of your cool reason, that he is a real and thorough bad one, which is more than possible, he shall be left to his fate, without any farther interference on my part, at all events."
"Oh, no, aunt," entreated Rose.
"Oh, yes, aunt," said the doctor. "Is it a bargain?"
"He cannot be hardened in vice," said Rose. "It is impossible."
"Very good," retorted the doctor. "Then so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition."
Finally, the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereunto sat down to wait, with some impatience, until Oliver should awake. The patience of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial than Mr. Losberne had led them to expect; for hour after hour passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence that he was at length sufficiently restored to be spoken to. The boy was very ill, he said, and weak from the loss of blood; but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to disclose something, that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity than to insist upon his remaining quiet until next morning, which he should otherwise have done. The conference was a long one. Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear, in the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child, recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh, if when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidences of human error, which, like dense and heavy clouds, are rising slowly, it is true, but not less surely, to heaven, to pour their after-vengeance on our heads. If we heard but one instant, in imagination, the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle, and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by gentle hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him as he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner concluded, and Oliver composed to rest again, than the doctor, after wiping his eyes, and condemning them for being weak all at once, betook himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles. And finding nobody about the parlours, it occurred to him that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen. So into the kitchen he went. There were assembled, in that lower house of the domestic parliament, the women servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half boots, and he looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind when the doctor entered. Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything before his superior said it. "Sit still," said the doctor, waving his hand.
"Thank you, sir," said Mr. Giles. "Missus wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I felt no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and was disposed for company, I'm taking mine among 'em here." Brittles headed a low murmur, by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express the gratification they derived from Mr. Giles's condescension. Mr. Giles looked round with a patronising air, as much as to say that so long as they behaved properly, he would never desert them. "How is the patient to-night, sir?" asked Giles. "So-so," returned the doctor. "I'm afraid you have got yourself into a scrape there, Mr. Giles." "I hope you don't mean to say, sir," said Mr. Giles, trembling, "that he's going to die? If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off. No, not even Brittles here, not for all the plate in the county, sir." "That's not the point," said the doctor mysteriously. "Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant?" Yes, sir. I hope so," faltered Mr. Giles, who had turned very pale.
"And what are you, boy?" said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles.
"Lor, bless me, sir," replied Brittles, starting violently, "I'm the same as Mr. Giles, sir."
"Then tell me this," said the doctor. "Both of you. Both of you. Are you going to take upon yourselves to swear that that boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it. Come, we are prepared for you." The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger, that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction. "Pay attention to the reply, constable, will you?" said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner, and tapping the bridge of his nose with it, to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's utmost acuteness. "Something may come of this before long." The constable looked as wise as he could, and took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner. "It's a simple question of identity, you will observe," said the doctor.
"That's what it is, sir," replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry, and some of it had gone the wrong way.
"Here's the house broken into," said the doctor, "and a couple of men catch one moment's glimpse of a boy, in the midst of gunpowder, smoke, and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness.
Here's a boy come to that very same house next morning, and because he happens to have his arm tied up, these men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which they place his life in great danger, and swear he is the thief. Now, the question is, whether these men are justified by the fact. If not, in what situation do they place themselves?" The constable nodded profoundly. He said if that wasn't the law, he would be glad to know what was. "I ask you again," thundered the doctor, "are you, on your solemn oaths, able to identify that boy?" Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles. Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles. The constable put his hand behind his ear to catch the reply. The two women and the tinker leaned forward to listen. The doctor glanced keenly round, when a ring was heard at the gate, and at the same moment the sound of wheels. "It's the runners!" cried Brittles, to all appearance much relieved. "The what?" exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn. "The Bow Street officers, sir," replied Brittles, taking up a candle. "Me and Mr. Giles sent for him this morning." "What!" cried the doctor. "Yes," replied Brittles. "I sent a message up by the coachman, and I only wonder they weren't here before, sir." "You did you? Then confound your slow coaches down here. That's all," said the doctor, walking away. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 31. Involves a critical position. "Who's that?" inquired Brittles, opening the door a little way, with the chain up, and peeping out, shading the candle with his hand. "Open the door," replied a man outside. "It's the officers from Bow Street, that we sent to today." Much comforted by this assurance, Brittles opened the door to its full width, and confronted a portly man in a greatcoat, who walked in, without saying anything more, and wiped his shoes on the mat, as coolly as if he lived there. "Just send somebody out to relieve my mate, will you, young man?" said the officer. "He's in the gig, a-minding the prad. Have you got a coach-house here, that you could put it up in, for 5 or 10 minutes?" Brittles replying in the affirmative, and pointing out to the building, the portly man stepped back to the garden gate, and helped his companion to put up the gig, while Brittles lighted them in a state of great admiration. This done, they returned to the house, and, being shown into a parlour, took off their great coats and hats, and showed like what they were. The man who had knocked at the door was a stout personage of middle height, aged about 50, with shiny black hair cropped pretty close, half whiskers, a round face, and sharp eyes. The other was a red-headed, bony man, in top boots, with a rather ill-favoured countenance, and a turned-up, sinister-looking nose. "Tell your governor that Blathers and Duff is here, will you?" said the stouter man, smoothing down his hair, and laying a pair of handcuffs on the table. "Oh, good evening, master. Can I have a word or two with you in private, if you please?" This was addressed to Mr. Losberne, who now made his appearance. That gentleman, motioning Brittles to retire, brought in the two ladies, and shut the door. "This is the lady of the house," said Mr. Losberne, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie. Mr. Blathers made a bow. Being desired to sit down, he put his hat on the floor, and taking a chair, motioned to Duff to do the same. The latter gentleman, who did not appear quite so much accustomed to good society, or quite so much at his ease in it, one of the two, seated himself, after undergoing several muscular affections of the limbs, and the head of his stick into his mouth, with some embarrassment. "Now, with regard to this here robbery, master," said Blathers, "what are the circumstances?" Mr. Losberne, who appeared desirous of gaining time, recounted them at great length, and with much circumlocution. Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked very knowing meanwhile, and occasionally exchanged a nod. "I can't say for certain till I see the work, of course," said Blathers; "but my opinion at once is—I don't mind committing myself to that extent—
that this wasn't done by a yokel, eh, Duff?"
"Certainly not,"
replied Duff.
"And translating the word yokel for the benefit of the ladies, I apprehend your meaning to be, that this attempt was not made by a countryman," said Mr. Losberne, with a smile.
"That's it, master," replied Blathers. "This is all about the robbery, is it?"
"All," replied the doctor.
"Now, what is this about this here boy that the servants are a-talking on?" said Blathers.
"Nothing at all,"
replied the doctor. "One of the frightened servants chose to take it into his head that he had something to do with this attempt to break into the house. But it's nonsense. Sheer absurdity."
"Very easy disposed of, if it is," remarked Duff.
"What he says is quite correct," observed Blathers, nodding his head in a confirmatory way, and playing carelessly with the handcuffs, as if they were a pair of castanets. "Who is the boy? What account does he give of himself? Where did he come from? He didn't drop out of the clouds, did he, master?"
"Of course not," replied the doctor, with a nervous glance at the two ladies. "I know his whole history, but we can talk about that presently. You would like, first, to see the place where the thieves made their attempt, I suppose?"
"Certainly," rejoined Mr. Blathers. "We had better inspect the premises first, and examine the servants afterwards. That's the usual way of doing business."
Lights were then procured, and Messrs. Blathers and Duff, attended by the native constable, Brittles, Giles, and everybody else in short, went into the little room at the end of the passage, and looked out at the window; and afterwards went round by way of the lawn, and looked in at the window; and after that, had a candle handed out to inspect the shutter with; and after that, a lantern to trace the footsteps with; and after that, a pitchfork to poke the bushes with. This done, amidst the breathless interest of all beholders, they came in again; and Mr. Giles and Brittles were put through a melodramatic representation of their share in the previous night's adventures, which they performed some 6 times over, contradicting each other in not more than one important respect, the first time, and in not more than a dozen the last. This consummation being arrived at, Blathers and Duff cleared the room, and held a long council together, compared with which, for secrecy and solemnity, a consultation of great doctors on the knottiest point in medicine would be mere child's play. Meanwhile, the doctor walked up and down the next room in a very uneasy state, and Mrs. Maylie and Rose looked on with anxious faces. "Upon my word," he said, making a halt, after a great number of very rapid turns, "I hardly know what to do."
"Surely," said Rose, "the poor child's story, faithfully repeated to these men, will be sufficient to exonerate him?"
"I doubt it, my dear young lady," said the doctor, shaking his head. "I don't think it would exonerate him, either with them or with legal functionaries of a higher grade. What is he, after all, they would say? A runaway. Judged by mere worldly considerations and probabilities, his story is a very doubtful one."
"You believe it, surely?"
interrupted Rose. "I believe it, strange as it is; and perhaps I may be an old fool for doing so," rejoined the doctor; "but I don't think it is exactly the tale for a practical police officer, nevertheless."
"Why not?"
demanded Rose. "Because, my pretty cross-examiner," replied the doctor, "because, viewed with their eyes, there are many ugly points about it. He can only prove the parts that look ill, and none of those that look well. Confound the fellows! They will have the why and the wherefore, and will take nothing for granted. On his own showing, you see, he has been the companion of thieves for some time past. He has been carried to a police officer on a charge of picking a gentleman's pocket. He has been taken away forcibly from that gentleman's house to a place which he cannot describe or point out, and of the situation of which he has not the remotest idea. He is brought down to Chertsey by men who seem to have taken a violent fancy to him, whether he will or no, and is put through a window to rob a house. And then, just at the very moment when he is going to alarm the inmates, and so do the very thing that would set him all to rights, there rushes into the way a blundering dog of a half-bred butler, and shoots him, as if on purpose to prevent his doing any good for himself. Don't you see all this?"
"I see it, of course,"
replied Rose, smiling at the doctor's impetuosity.
"But still I do not see anything in it to criminate the poor child."
"No," replied the doctor, "of course not. Bless the bright eyes of your sex! They never see, whether for good or bad, more than one side of any question, and that is always the one which first presents itself to them." Having given vent to this result of experience, the doctor put his hands into his pockets, and walked up and down the room with even greater rapidity than before. "The more I think of it," said the doctor, "the more I see that it will occasion endless trouble and difficulty if we put these men in possession of the boy's real story. I am certain it will not be believed, and even if they can do nothing to him in the end, still the dragging it forward and giving publicity to all the doubts that will be cast upon it must interfere materially with your benevolent plan of rescuing him from misery."
"Oh, what is to be done?" cried Rose. "Dear, dear, why did they send for these people?"
"Why, indeed!" exclaimed Mrs. Maylie. "I would not have had them here for the world."
"All I know is," said Mr. Losberne, at last, sitting down with a kind of desperate calmness, "that we must try and carry it off with a bold face. The object is a good one, and that must be our excuse. The boy has strong symptoms of fever upon him, and is in no condition to be talked to any more. That's one comfort. We must make the best of it, and if bad be the best, it is no fault of ours. Come in." "Well, master," said Blathers, entering the room followed by his colleague, and making the door fast before he said any more, "this warn't a put-up thing." "And what the devil's a put-up thing?" demanded the doctor impatiently. "We call it a put-up robbery, ladies," said Blathers, turning to them, as if he pitied their ignorance, but had a contempt for the doctor's, "when the servants is in it." "Nobody suspected them in this case," said Mrs. Maylie. "Very likely not, ma'am," replied Blathers, "but they might have been in it for all that." "More likely on that wery account," said Duff. "We find it was a town hand," said Blathers, continuing his report, "for the style of work is first rate." "Wery pretty indeed it is," remarked Duff, in an undertone. "There was two of 'em in it," continued Blathers, "and they had a boy with 'em. That's plain from the size of the window. That's all to be said at present. We'll see this lad that you've got upstairs at once, if you please." "Perhaps they will take something to drink first, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, his face brightening as if some new thought had occurred to him.
"Oh, to be sure!"
exclaimed Rose eagerly.
"You shall have it immediately, if you will."
"Why, thank you, miss," said Blathers, drawing his coat-sleeve across his mouth. "It's dry work, this sort of duty. Anythink that's handy, miss. Don't put yourself out of the way on our accounts." "What shall it be?" asked the doctor, following the young lady to the sideboard. "A little drop of spirits, master, if it's all the same," replied Blathers. "It's a cold ride from London, ma'am, and I always find the spirits comes home warmer to the feelings."
This interesting communication was addressed to Mrs. Maylie, who received it very graciously. While it was being conveyed to her, the doctor slipped out of the room. "Ah!" said Mr. Blathers, not holding his wine-glass by the stem, but grasping the bottom between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand, and placing it in front of his chest. "I have seen a good many pieces of business like this in my time, ladies."
"That crack down in the back lane at Edmonton, Blathers," said Mr. Duff, assisting his colleague's memory.
"That was something in this way, warn't it?" rejoined Mr. Blathers. "That was done by Conkey Chickweed, that was."
"You always gave that to him," replied Duff. "It was the family pet, I told you. Conkey hadn't any more to do with it than I had."
"Get out!" retorted Mr. Blathers. "I know better. Do you mind that time when Conkey was robbed of his money, though? What a start that was! Better than any novel book I ever see."
"What was that?"
inquired Rose, anxious to encourage any symptoms of good humour in the unwelcome visitors. "It was a robbery, miss, that hardly anybody would have been down upon," said Blathers.
This here Conkey Chickweed—" "Conkey means nosy, ma'am," interposed Duff. "Of course the lady knows that, don't she?" demanded Mr. Blathers. "Always interrupting you, partner. This here Conkey Chickweed, miss, kept a public house over Battlebridge way, and he had a cellar, where a good many young lords went to see cock-fighting and badger-drawing and that, and a wery intellectual manner the sports was conducted in, for I seen him often. He warn't one of the family at that time, and one night he was robbed of 327 guineas in a canvas bag that was stole out of his bedroom in the dead of night, by a tall man with a black patch over his eye, who had concealed himself under the bed, and after committing the robbery, jumped slap out of the window, which was only a story high. He was wery quick about it, but Conkey was quick too, for he fired a blunderbuss arter him, and roused the neighbourhood. They set up a hue and cry directly, and when they came to look about 'em, found that Conkey had hit the robber, for there was traces of blood all the way to some palings a good distance off, and there they lost him. However, he made off with the blunt, and consequently the name of Mr. Chickweed, licensed whittler, appeared in the Gazette among the other bankrupts, and all manner of benefits and subscriptions, and I don't know what all, was got up for the poor man, who was in a wery low state of mind about his loss, and went up and down the streets for 3 or 4 days, a-pulling his hair off in such a desperate manner that many people was afraid he might be going to make away with himself. One day he came up to the office, all in a hurry, and had a private interview with the magistrate, who, after a deal of talk, rings the bell, and orders Jem Spyers in (Jem was a active officer), and tells him to go and assist Mr. Chickweed in apprehending the man as robbed his house. "I see him, Spyers," said Chickweed, "pass my house yesterday morning." "Why didn't you up and collar him?" says Spyers. "I was so struck all of a heap that you might have fractured my skull with a toothpick," says the poor man. "But we're sure to have him, for between 10 and 11 o'clock at night he passed again." Spyers no sooner heard this, than he put some clean linen and a comb in his pocket in case he should have to stop a day or two, and away he goes, and sets himself down at one of the public-house windows behind the little red curtain, with his hat on, all ready to bolt out at a moment's notice. He was smoking his pipe here, late at night, when all of a sudden Chickweed roars out, "Here he is! Stop thief! Murder!" Jem Spyers dashes out, and there he sees Chickweed a-tearing down the street full cry. Away goes Spyers, on goes Chickweed, round turns the people, everybody roars out "Thieves!" and Chickweed himself keeps on shouting all the time like mad. Spyers loses sight of him a minute as he turns a corner, shoots round, sees a little crowd, dives in. "Which is the man?" "Damn me," says Chickweed, "I've lost him again." It was a remarkable occurrence, but he warn't to be seen nowhere, so they went back to the public-house. Next morning, Spyers took his old place, and looked out, from behind the curtain, for a tall man with a black patch over his eye, till his own 2 eyes ached again. At last, he couldn't help shutting 'em, to ease 'em a minute, and from the very moment he did so, he hears Chickweed a-roaring out, "Here he is!" Off he starts once more, with Chickweed half-way down the street ahead of him, and after twice as long a run as the yesterday's one, the man's lost again. This was done once or twice more, till one half the neighbours gave out that Mr. Chickweed had been robbed by the devil, who was playing tricks with him arterwards, and the other half that poor Mr. Chickweed had gone mad with grief. "What did Jem Spyers say?" inquired the doctor, who had returned to the room shortly after the commencement of the story. "Jem Spyers," resumed the officer, "for a long time said nothing at all, and listened to everything without seeming to, which showed he understood his business. But, one morning, he walked into the bar, and taking out his snuff-box, says, 'Chickweed, I found out who done this here robbery.' 'Have you?' said Chickweed. 'Oh, my dear Spyers, only let me have wengeance, and I shall die contented. Oh, my dear Spyers, where is this villain?" "Come," said Spyers, offering him a pinch of snuff. "None of that gammon. You did it yourself." "So he had, and a good bit of money he had made by it, too, and nobody would never have found it out, if he hadn't been so precious anxious to keep up appearances," said Mr. Blathers, putting down his wine-glass, and clinking the handcuffs together. "Very curious indeed," observed the doctor. "Now, if you please, you can walk upstairs." "If you please, sir," returned Mr. Blathers. Closely following Mr. Losberne, the two officers ascended to Oliver's bedroom, Mr. Giles preceding the party with a lighted candle. Oliver had been dozing, but looked worse, and was more feverish than he had appeared yet. Being assisted by the doctor, he managed to sit up in bed for a minute or so, and looked at the strangers without at all understanding what was going forward; in fact, without seeming to recollect where he was, or what had been passing. "This," said Mr. Losberne, speaking softly, but with great vehemence, notwithstanding, "this is the lad who, being accidentally wounded by a spring gun in some boyish trespass on Mr. What-d'ye-call-him's ground at the back here, comes to the house for assistance this morning, and is immediately laid hold of and maltreated by that ingenious gentleman with the candle in his hand, who has placed his life in considerable danger, as I can professionally certify." Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked at Mr. Giles, as he was thus recommended to their notice. The bewildered butler gazed from them towards Oliver, and from Oliver towards Mr. Losberne, with a most ludicrous mixture of fear and perplexity. "You don't mean to deny that, I suppose?" said the doctor, laying Oliver gently down again. "It was all done for the best, sir," answered Giles. "I am sure I thought it was the boy, or I wouldn't have meddled with him. I am not of an inhuman disposition, sir." "Thought it was what boy?" inquired the senior officer. "The housebreaker's boy, sir," replied Giles. They certainly had a boy." "Well, do you think so now?" inquired Blathers. "Think what now?" replied Giles, looking vacantly at his questioner. "Think it's the same boy, stupid head," rejoined Blathers impatiently. "I don't know. I really don't know," said Giles, with a rueful countenance. "I couldn't swear to him." "What do you think?" asked Mr. Blathers. I don't know what to think," replied poor Giles. "I don't think it is the boy. Indeed, I'm almost certain that it isn't. You know, it can't be." "Has this man been a-drinking, sir?" inquired Blathers, turning to the doctor. "What a precious muddle-headed chap you are!" said Duff, addressing Mr. Giles with supreme contempt. Mr. Losberne had been feeling the patient's pulse during this short dialogue, but he now rose from the chair by the bedside, and remarked that if the officers had any doubts upon the subject, they would perhaps like to step into the next room and have Brittles before them. Acting upon this suggestion, they adjourned to a neighbouring apartment, where Mr. Brittles, being called in, involved himself and his respected superior in such a wonderful maze of fresh contradictions and impossibilities, as tended to throw no particular light on anything; but the fact of his own strong mystification, except indeed his declarations that he shouldn't know the real boy if he were put before him in that instant, that he had only taken Oliver to be he, because Mr. Giles had said he was, and that Mr. Giles had, 5 minutes previously, admitted in the kitchen that he began to be very much afraid he had been a little too hasty. Among other ingenious surmises, the question was then raised whether Mr. Giles had really hit anybody; and upon examination of the fellow pistol to that which he had fired, it turned out to have no more destructive loading than gunpowder and brown paper; a discovery which made a considerable impression on everybody but the doctor, who had drawn the ball about 10 minutes before. Upon no one, however, did it make a greater impression than on Mr. Giles himself, who, after labouring for some hours under the fear of having mortally wounded a fellow creature, eagerly caught at this new idea, and favoured it to the utmost. Finally,
the officers, without troubling themselves very much about Oliver, left the Chertsey constable in the house, and took up their rest for that night in the town, promising to return the next morning. With the next morning, there came a rumour that 2 men and a boy were in the cage at Kingston, who had been apprehended overnight under suspicious circumstances, and to Kingston Messrs. Blathers and Duff journeyed accordingly. The suspicious circumstances, however, resolving themselves, on investigation, into the one fact that they had been discovered sleeping under a haystack, which, although a great crime, is only punishable by imprisonment, and is, in the merciful eye of the English law and its comprehensive love of all the king's subjects, held to be no satisfactory proof, in the absence of all other evidence, that the sleeper or sleepers have committed burglary accompanied with violence, and have therefore rendered themselves liable to the punishment of death. Messrs. Blathers and Duff came back again, as wise as they went. In short, after some more examination, and a great deal more conversation, a neighbouring magistrate was readily induced to take the joint bail of Mrs. Maylie and Mr. Losberne for Oliver's appearance, if he should ever be called upon; and Blathers and Duff, being rewarded with a couple of guineas, returned to town with divided opinions on the subject of their expedition. The latter gentleman, on a mature consideration of all the circumstances, inclining to the belief that the burglarious attempt had originated with the family pet; and the former being equally disposed to concede the full merit of it to the great Mr. Conkey Chickweed. Meanwhile, Oliver gradually throve and prospered under the united care of Mrs. Maylie, Rose, and the kind-hearted Mr. Losberne. If fervent prayers, gushing from hearts overcharged with gratitude, be heard in heaven, and if they be not, what prayers are, the blessings which the orphan child called down upon them, sunk into their souls, diffusing peace and happiness. Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 32. Of the happy life Oliver began to lead with his kind friends. Oliver's ailings were neither slight nor few. In addition to the pain and delay attendant on a broken limb, his exposure to the wet and cold had brought on fever and ague, which hung about him for many weeks, and reduced him sadly. But, at length, he began, by slow degrees, to get better, and to be able to say sometimes, in a few tearful words, how deeply he felt the goodness of the 2 sweet ladies, and how ardently he hoped that when he grew strong and well again, he could do something to show his gratitude, only something which would let them see the love and duty with which his breast was full; something, however slight, which would prove to them that their gentle kindness had not been cast away, but that the poor boy whom their charity had rescued from misery or death was eager to serve them with his whole heart and soul. "Poor fellow!" said Rose, when Oliver had been one day feebly endeavouring to utter the words of thankfulness that rose to his pale lips. "You shall have many opportunities of serving us, if you will. We are going into the country, and my aunt intends that you shall accompany us. The quiet place, the pure air, and all the pleasure and beauties of spring will restore you in a few days. We will employ you in 100 ways, when you can bear the trouble."
"The trouble!"
cried Oliver.
"Oh, dear lady, if I could but work for you! If I could only give you pleasure by watering your flowers, or watching your birds, or running up and down the whole day long to make you happy, what would I give to do it?"
"You shall give nothing at all," said Miss Maylie, smiling, "for, as I told you before, we shall employ you in 100 ways; and if you only take half the trouble to please us that you promise now, you will make me very happy indeed."
"Happy, ma'am!"
cried Oliver.
"How kind of you to say so!"
"You will make me happier than I can tell you," replied the young lady. "To think that my dear good aunt should have been the means of rescuing any one from such sad misery as you have described to us, would be an unspeakable pleasure to me.
but to know that the object of her goodness and compassion was sincerely grateful and attached, in consequence, would delight me more than you can well imagine. Do you understand me?" she inquired, watching Oliver's thoughtful face.
"Oh, yes, ma'am, yes,"
replied Oliver eagerly.
"but I was thinking that I am ungrateful now."
"To whom?" inquired the young lady.
"To the kind gentleman and the dear old nurse who took so much care of me before,"
rejoined Oliver.
"If they knew how happy I am, they would be pleased, I am sure."
"I am sure that they would," rejoined Oliver's benefactress. "And Mr. Losberne has already been kind enough to promise that when you are well enough to bear the journey, he will carry you to see them."
"Has he, ma'am?"
cried Oliver, his face brightening with pleasure.
"I don't know what I shall do for joy when I see their kind faces once again."
In a short time, Oliver was sufficiently recovered to undergo the fatigue of this expedition. One morning he and Mr. Losberne set out, accordingly, in a little carriage which belonged to Mrs. Maylie. When they came to Chertsey Bridge, Oliver turned very pale, and uttered a loud exclamation. "What's the matter with the boy?" cried the doctor, as usual, all in a bustle. "Do you see anything, hear anything, feel anything, eh?"
"That, sir,"
cried Oliver, pointing out of the carriage window.
"that house."
"Yes? Well, what of it? Stop, coachman! Pull up here!" cried the doctor. "What of the house, my man, eh?"
"The thieves. The house they took me to,"
whispered Oliver.
"The devil it is!" cried the doctor. "Hallo there! Let me out!"
But before the coachman could dismount from his box, he had tumbled out of the coach by some means or other, and, running down to the deserted tenement, began kicking at the door like a madman.
"Hello!"
said a little ugly hump-backed man, opening the door so suddenly that the doctor, from the very impetus of his last kick, nearly fell forward into the passage.
"What's the matter here?"
"Matter!"
exclaimed the other, collaring him without a moment's reflection.
"A good deal. Robbery is the matter."
"There'll be murder the matter, too,"
replied the hump-backed man coolly,
"if you don't take your hands off. Do you hear me?"
"I hear you,"
said the doctor, giving his captive a hearty shake.
"Confound the fellow, what's his rascally name? Sikes. That's it. Where's Sikes, you thief?"
The hump-backed man stared, as if in excess of amazement and indignation; then, twisting himself dexterously from the doctor's grasp, growled forth a volley of horrid oaths, and retired into the house. Before he could shut the door, however, the doctor had passed into the parlour without a word of parley. He looked anxiously round. Not an article of furniture, not a vestige of anything, animate or inanimate, not even the position of the cupboards, answered Oliver's description.
"Now,"
said the hump-backed man, who had watched him keenly,
"what do you mean by coming into my house in this violent way? Do you want to rob me, or to murder me? Which is it?"
"Did you ever know a man come out to do either, in a chariot and pair, you ridiculous old vampire?" said the irritable doctor.
"What do you want, then?"
demanded the hunchback.
"Will you take yourself off, before I do you a mischief? Curse you!"
"As soon as I think proper,"
said Mr. Losberne, looking into the other parlour, which, like the first, bore no resemblance whatever to Oliver's account of it.
"I shall find you out some day, my friend."
"Will you?"
sneered the ill-favoured cripple.
"If you ever want me, I'm here. I haven't lived here mad and all alone for 25 years to be scared by you. You shall pay for this. You shall pay for this."
And so saying, the misshapen little demon set up a yell, and danced upon the ground as if wild with rage.
"Stupid enough, this," muttered the doctor to himself. "The boy must have made a mistake. Here, put that in your pocket, and shut yourself up again."
With these words, he flung the hunchback a piece of money, and returned to the carriage. The man followed to the chariot door, and, leaving the doctor alone, went out into the street.
uttering the wildest imprecations and curses all the way; but as Mr. Losberne turned to speak to the driver, he looked into the carriage, and eyed Oliver for an instant with a glance so sharp and fierce, and at the same time so furious and vindictive, that, waking or sleeping, he could not forget it for months afterwards. He continued to utter the most fearful imprecations until the driver had resumed his seat; and when they were once more on their way, they could see him some distance behind, beating his feet upon the ground, and tearing his hair, in transports of real or pretended rage. "I am an ass," said the doctor, after a long silence. "Did you know that before, Oliver?"
"No, sir."
"Then don't forget it another time. An ass," said the doctor again, after a further silence of some minutes. "Even if it had been the right place, and the right fellows had been there, what could I have done, single-handed? And if I had had assistance, I see no good that I should have done, except leading to my own exposure, and an unavoidable statement of the manner in which I have hushed up this business. That would have served me right, though. I'm always involving myself in some scrape or other by acting on impulse. It might have done me good." Now, the fact was, that the excellent doctor had never acted upon anything but impulse all through his life; and it was no bad compliment to the nature of the impulse which governed him, that so far from being involved in any peculiar troubles or misfortunes, he had the warmest respect and esteem of all who knew him. If the truth must be told, he was a little out of temper, for a minute or two, at being disappointed in procuring corroborative evidence of Oliver's story on the very first occasion on which he had a chance of obtaining any. He soon came round again, however, and finding that Oliver's replies to his questions were still as straightforward and consistent, and still delivered with as much apparent sincerity and truth as they had ever been, he made up his mind to attach full credence to them from that time forth. As Oliver knew the name of the street in which Mr. Brownlow resided, they were enabled to drive straight thither. When the coach turned into it, his heart beat so violently that he could scarcely draw his breath. "Now, my boy, which house is it?" inquired Mr. Losberne.
That,
replied Oliver, pointing eagerly out of the window.
the White House. Oh, make haste! Pray make haste! I feel as if I should die. It makes me tremble so."
"Come, come," said the good doctor, patting him on the shoulder. "You will see them directly, and they will be overjoyed to find you safe and well."
"Oh, I hope so,"
cried Oliver.
"They were so good to me, so very, very good to me."
The coach rolled on. It stopped. No, that was the wrong house. The next door. It went on a few paces, and stopped again. Oliver looked up at the windows, with tears of happy expectation coursing down his face. Alas! the White House was empty, and there was a bill in the window, "To let." "Knock at the next door," cried Mr. Losberne, taking Oliver's arm in his. "What has become of Mr. Brownlow, who used to live in the adjoining house, do you know?" The servant did not know, but would go and inquire. She presently returned, and said that Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods, and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks before. Oliver clasped his hands, and sank feebly backward. "Has his housekeeper gone too?" inquired Mr. Losberne, after a moment's pause. "Yes, sir," replied the servant. "The old gentleman, the housekeeper, and a gentleman who was a friend of Mr. Brownlow's, all went together." "Then turn towards home again," said Mr. Losberne to the driver, "and don't stop to bait the horses till you get out of this confounded London."
"The bookstall keeper, sir," said Oliver. "I know the way there. See him, pray, sir. Do see him."
"My poor boy, this is disappointment enough for one day," said the doctor. "Quite enough for both of us. If we go to the bookstall keeper's, we shall certainly find that he is dead, or has set his house on fire, or run away. No, home again straight." And in obedience to the doctor's impulse, home they went. This bitter disappointment caused Oliver much sorrow and grief, even in the midst of his happiness, for he had pleased himself many times during his illness with thinking of all that Mr. Brownlow and Mrs. Bedwin would say to him, and what delight it would be to tell them how many long days and nights he had passed in reflecting on what they had done for him, and in bewailing his cruel separation from them. the hope of eventually clearing himself with them too, and explaining how he had been forced away, had buoyed him up and sustained him under many of his recent trials; and now the idea that they should have gone so far, and carried with them the belief that he was an impostor and a robber, a belief which might remain uncontradicted to his dying day, was almost more than he could bear. The circumstance occasioned no alteration, however, in the behaviour of his benefactors. After another fortnight, when the fine warm weather had fairly begun, and every tree and flower was putting forth its young leaves and rich blossoms, they made preparations for quitting the house at Chertsey for some months. Sending the plate which had so excited Fagin's cupidity to the banker's, and leaving Giles and another servant in care of the house, they departed to a cottage at some distance in the country, and took Oliver with them. Who can describe the pleasure and delight, the peace of mind and soft tranquillity, the sickly boy felt in the balmy air, and among the green hills and rich woods of an inland village? Who can tell how scenes of peace and quietude sink into the minds of pain-worn dwellers in close and noisy places, and carry their own freshness deep into their jaded hearts? Men who have lived in crowded, pent-up streets through lives of toil, and who have never wished for change; men to whom custom has indeed been second nature, and who have come almost to love each brick and stone that formed the narrow boundaries of their daily walks; even they, with the hand of death upon them, have been known to yearn at last for one short glimpse of Nature's face, and, carried far from the scenes of their old pains and pleasures, have seemed to pass at once into a new state of being. Crawling forth, from day to day, to some green sunny spot, they have had such memories wakened up within them by the sight of the sky, and hill, and plain, and glistening water, that a foretaste of heaven itself has soothed their quick decline, and they have sunk into their tombs as peacefully as the sun whose setting they watched from their lonely chamber window but a few hours before, faded from their dim and feeble sight. The memories which peaceful country scenes call up are not of this world, nor of its thoughts and hopes. Their gentle influence may teach us how to weave fresh garlands for the graves of those we loved, may purify our thoughts, and bear down before it old enmity and hatred; but beneath all this, there lingers in the least reflective mind a vague and half-formed consciousness of having held such feelings long before, in some remote and distant time, which calls up solemn thoughts of distant times to come, and bends down pride and worldliness beneath it. It was a lovely spot to which they repaired. Oliver, whose days had been spent among squalid crowds, and in the midst of noise and brawling, seemed to enter on a new existence there. The rose and honeysuckle clung to the cottage walls, the ivy crept round the trunks of the trees, and the garden flowers perfumed the air with delicious odours. Hard by was a little churchyard, not crowded with tall unsightly gravestones, but full of humble mounds, covered with fresh turf and moss, beneath which the old people of the village lay at rest. Oliver often wandered there, and, thinking of the wretched grave in which his mother lay, would sometimes sit him down and sob unseen; but, when he raised his eyes to the deep sky overhead, he would cease to think of her as lying in the ground, and would weep for her, sadly but without pain. It was a happy time. The days were peaceful and serene, the nights brought with them neither fear nor care, no languishing in a wretched prison, or associating with wretched men, nothing but pleasant and happy thoughts. Every morning he went to a white-headed old gentleman, who lived near the little church, who taught him to read better, and to write, and who spoke so kindly, and took such pains, that Oliver could never try enough to please him. Then he would walk with Mrs. Maylie and Rose, and hear them talk of books, or perhaps sit near them in some shady place, and listen whilst the young lady read, which he could have done until it grew too dark to see the letters. Then he had his own lesson for the next day to prepare, and at this he would work hard in a little room which looked into the garden, till evening came slowly on, when the ladies would walk out again, and he with them, listening with such pleasure to all they said, and so happy if they wanted a flower that he could climb to reach, or had forgotten anything he could run to fetch, that he could never be quick enough about it. When it became quite dark, and they returned home, the young lady would sit down to the piano, and play some pleasant air, or sing, in a low and gentle voice, some old song which it pleased her aunt to hear. There would be no candles lighted at such times as these, and Oliver would sit by one of the windows, listening to the sweet music in a perfect rapture. And when Sunday came, how differently the day was spent from any way in which he had ever spent it yet, and how happily too, like all the other days in that most happy time. There was the little church in the morning, with the green leaves fluttering at the windows, the birds singing without, and the sweet-smelling air stealing in at the low porch, and filling the homely building with its fragrance. The poor people were so neat and clean, and knelt so reverently in prayer, that it seemed a pleasure, not a tedious duty, their assembling there together. And though the singing might be rude, it was real, and sounded more musical, to Oliver's ears at least, than any he had ever heard in church before. Then there were the walks as usual, and many calls at the clean houses of the labouring men; and at night Oliver read a chapter or two from the Bible, which he had been studying all the week, and in the performance of which duty he felt more proud and pleased than if he had been the clergyman himself. In the morning, Oliver would be afoot by 6 o'clock, roaming the fields, and plundering the hedges, far and wide, for nosegays of wild flowers, with which he would return laden home, and which it took great care and consideration to arrange, to the best advantage, for the embellishment of the breakfast table. There was fresh groundsel, too, for Miss Maylie's birds, with which Oliver, who had been studying the subject under the able tuition of the village clerk, would decorate the cages in the most approved taste. When the birds were made all spruce and smart for the day, there was usually some little commission of charity to execute in the village; or, failing that, there was rare cricket playing, sometimes on the green; or, failing that, there was always something to do in the garden, or about the plants, to which Oliver, who had studied this science also, under the same master, who was a gardener by trade, applied himself with hearty good will, until Miss Rose made her appearance, when there were 1,000 commendations to be bestowed on all he had done. So 3 months glided away. 3 months which, in the life of the most blessed and favoured of mortals, might have been unmingled happiness, and which, in Oliver's, were true felicity. With the purest and most amiable generosity on one side, and the truest, warmest, soul-felt gratitude on the other, it is no wonder that, by the end of that short time, Oliver Twist had become completely domesticated with the old lady and her niece, and that the fervent attachment of his young and sensitive heart was repaid by their pride in, and attachment to, himself. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Oliver Twist. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 33. Wherein the happiness of Oliver and his friends experiences a sudden check. Spring flew swiftly by, and summer came. If the village had been beautiful at first, it was now in the full glow and luxuriance of its richness. The great trees, which had looked shrunken and bare in the early months, had now burst into strong life and health, and stretching forth their green arms over the thirsty ground, converted open and naked spots into choice nooks, where there was a deep and pleasant shade from which to look upon the wide prospect, steeped in sunshine, which lay stretched beyond. The earth had donned her mantle of brightest green, and shed her richest perfumes abroad. It was the prime and vigour of the year. All things were glad and flourishing. Still the same quiet life went on at the little cottage, and the same cheerful serenity prevailed among its inmates. Oliver had long since grown stout and healthy, but health or sickness made no difference in his warm feelings of a great many people. He was still the same gentle, attached, affectionate creature that he had been when pain and suffering had wasted his strength, and when he was dependent for every slight attention and comfort on those who tended him. One beautiful night, when they had taken a longer walk than was customary with them, for the day had been unusually warm, and there was a brilliant moon, and a light wind had sprung up which was unusually refreshing. Rose had been in high spirits too, and they had walked on in merry conversation until they had far exceeded their ordinary bounds. Mrs. Maylie being fatigued, they returned more slowly home. The young lady, merely throwing off her simple bonnet, sat down to the piano as usual. After running abstractedly over the keys for a few minutes, she fell into a low and very solemn air, and as she played it, they heard a sound as if she were weeping.
"Rose, my dear,"
said the elderly lady. Rose made no reply, but played a little quicker, as though the words had roused her from some painful thoughts.
"Rose, my love,"
cried Mrs. Maylie, rising hastily and bending over her,
"what is this? In tears? My dear child, what distresses you?"
"Nothing, aunt, nothing,"
replied the young lady.
"I don't know what it is. I can't describe it, but I feel—"
"Not ill, my love?"
interposed Mrs. Maylie.
"No, oh, not ill,"
replied Rose, shuddering as though some deadly chillness were passing over her while she spoke.
"I shall be better presently. Close the window, pray."
Oliver hastened to comply with her request. The young lady, making an effort to recover her cheerfulness, strove to play some livelier tune, but her fingers dropped powerless over the keys. Covering her face with her hands, she sank upon a sofa, and gave vent to the tears which she was now unable to repress.
"My child,"
said the elderly lady, folding her arms about her,
"I never saw you so before."
"I would not alarm you if I could avoid it," rejoined Rose; "but indeed I have tried very hard, and cannot help this. I fear I am ill, aunt."
She was, indeed; for, when the candles were brought, they saw that in the very short time which had elapsed since their return home, the hue of her countenance had changed to a marble whiteness. Its expression had lost nothing of its beauty, but it was changed, and there was an anxious, haggard look about the gentle face, which it had never worn before. Another minute, and it was suffused with a crimson flush, and a heavy wildness came over the soft blue eye. Again this disappeared, like the shadow thrown by a passing cloud, and she was once more deadly pale. Oliver, who watched the old lady anxiously, observed that she was alarmed by these appearances, and so in truth was he; but seeing that she affected to make light of them, he endeavoured to do the same, and they so far succeeded that when Rose was persuaded by her aunt to retire for the night, she was in better spirits, and appeared even in better health, assuring them that she felt certain she would rise in the morning quite well.
"I hope,"
said Oliver, when Mrs. Maylie returned,
"that nothing is the matter. She don't look well to-night, but—"
The old lady motioned to him not to speak, and sitting herself down in a dark corner of the room, remained silent for some time. At length she said, in a trembling voice,
"I hope not, Oliver. I have been very happy with her for some years. Too happy, perhaps. It may be time that I should meet with some misfortune, but I hope it is not this."
"What?"
inquired Oliver.
"The heavy blow," said the old lady, "of losing the dear girl who has so long been my comfort and happiness."
"Oh, God forbid!"
exclaimed Oliver hastily.
"Amen to that, my child,"
said the old lady, wringing her hands.
"Surely there is no danger of anything so dreadful?"
said Oliver.
2 hours ago she was quite well."
"She is very ill now," rejoined Mrs. Maylie, "and will be worse, I am sure. My dear, dear Rose! Oh, what shall I do without her?"
She gave way to such great grief, that Oliver, suppressing his own emotion, ventured to remonstrate with her, and to beg earnestly that, for the sake of the dear young lady herself, she would be more calm.
"And consider, ma'am,"
said Oliver, as the tears forced themselves into his eyes, despite all of his efforts to the contrary.
"Oh, consider how young and good she is, and what pleasure and comfort she gives to all about her. I am sure, certain, quite certain, that for your sake, who are so good yourself, and for her own, and for the sake of all she makes so happy, she will not die. Heaven will never let her die so young."
"Hush!" said Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand on Oliver's head. "You think like a child, poor boy. But you teach me my duty notwithstanding. I had forgotten it for a moment, Oliver. But I hope I may be pardoned, for I am old, and have seen enough of illness and death to know the agony of separation from the objects of our love. I have seen enough, too, to know that it is not always the youngest and best who are spared to those that love them. But this should give us comfort in our sorrow, for Heaven is just, and such things teach us, impressively, that there is a brighter world than this, and that the passage to it is speedy. God's will be done. I love her, and He knows how well." Oliver was surprised to see that as Mrs. Maylie said these words, she checked her lamentations as though by one effort, and drawing herself up as she spoke, became composed and firm. He was still more astonished to find that this firmness lasted, and that, under all the care and watching which ensued, Mrs. Maylie was ever ready and collected, performing all the duties which had devolved upon her, steadily, and, to all external appearances, even cheerfully. But he was young, and did not know what strong minds are capable of under trying circumstances. How should he, when their possessors so seldom know themselves? An anxious night ensued. When morning came, Mrs. Maylie's predictions were but too well verified. Rose was in the first stage of a high and dangerous fever. "We must be active, Oliver, and not give way to useless grief," said Mrs. Maylie, laying her finger on her lip, as she looked steadily into his face. "This letter must be sent, with all possible expedition, to Mr. Losberne. It must be carried to the market town, which is not more than 4 miles off, by the footpath across the field, and thence dispatched by an express on horseback straight to Chertsey. The people at the inn will undertake to do this, and I can trust to you to see it done, I know." Oliver could make no reply, but looked his anxiety to be gone at once. "Here is another letter," said Mrs. Maylie, pausing to reflect. "But whether to send it now, or wait until I see how Rose goes on, I scarcely know. I would not forward it unless I feared the worst."
"Is it for Chertsey too, ma'am?" inquired Oliver, impatient to execute his commission, and holding out his trembling hand for the letter.
"No," replied the old lady, giving it to him mechanically. Oliver glanced at it, and saw that it was directed to Harry Maylie, Esquire, at some great lord's house in the country, where he could not make out.
"Shall it go, ma'am?"
asked Oliver, looking up impatiently. "I think not," replied Mrs. Maylie, taking it back. "I will wait until to-morrow." With these words, she gave Oliver her purse, and he started off, without more delay, at the greatest speed he could muster. Swiftly he ran across the fields, and down the little lanes which sometimes divided them, now almost hidden by the high corn on either side, and now emerging on an open field, where the mowers and haymakers were busy at their work. Nor did he stop once, save now and then for a few seconds to recover breath, until he came, in a great heat and covered with dust, on the little market-place of the market town. Here he paused, and looked about for the inn. There were a white bank, a red brewery, and a yellow town hall, and in one corner there was a large house with all the wood about it painted green, before which was the sign of the George. To this he hastened as soon as it caught his eye. He spoke to a postboy who was dozing under the gateway, and who, after hearing what he wanted, referred him to the ostler, who, after hearing all he had to say again, referred him to the landlord, who was a tall gentleman in a blue neckcloth, a white hat, drab breeches, and boots with tops to match, leaning against a pump by the stable door, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. This gentleman walked with much deliberation into the bar to make out the bill, which took a long time making out, and after it was ready,
and paid, a horse had to be saddled, and a man to be dressed, which took up 10 good minutes more. Meanwhile, Oliver was in such a desperate state of impatience and anxiety, that he felt as if he could have jumped upon the horse himself, and galloped away, full tear, to the next stage. At length, all was ready, and the little parcel having been handed up, with many injunctions and entreaties for its speedy delivery, the man set spurs to his horse, and rattling over the uneven paving of the market-place, was out of the town, and galloping along the turnpike road in a couple of minutes. As it was something to feel certain that assistance was sent for, and that no time had been lost, Oliver hurried up the inn-yard with a somewhat lighter heart. He was turning out of the gateway, when he accidentally stumbled against a tall man wrapped in a cloak, who was at that moment coming out of the inn-door.
"Ha!"
cried the man, fixing his eyes on Oliver, and suddenly recoiling.
"What the devil's this?"
"I beg your pardon, sir,"
said Oliver.
"I was in a great hurry to get home, and didn't see you were coming."
"Death!"
muttered the man to himself, glaring at the boy with his large dark eyes.
"Who would have thought it? Grind him to ashes! He'd start up from a stone coffin to come in my way."
"I'm sorry,"
stammered Oliver, confused by the strange man's wild look.
"I hope I have not hurt you."
"Rot you!"
murmured the man in a horrible passion, between his clenched teeth.
"If I had only had the courage to say the word, I might have been free of you in a night. Curses on your head, and black death on your heart, you imp! What are you doing here?"
The man shook his fist as he uttered these words incoherently. He advanced towards Oliver, as if with the intention of aiming a blow at him, but fell violently on the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. Oliver gazed for a moment at the struggles of the madman, for such he supposed him to be, and then darted into the house for help. Having seen him safely carried into the hotel, he turned his face homewards, running as fast as he could, to make up for lost time, and recalling with a great deal of astonishment and some fear the extraordinary behaviour of the person from whom he had just parted. The circumstance did not dwell in his recollection long, however, for when he reached the cottage, there was enough to occupy his mind, and to drive all considerations of self completely from his memory. Rose Maylie had rapidly grown worse. Before midnight she was delirious. A medical practitioner who resided on the spot was in constant attendance upon her, and after first seeing the patient, he had taken Mrs. Maylie aside, and pronounced her disorder to be one of a most alarming nature. "In fact," he said, "it would be little short of a miracle if she recovered." How often did Oliver start from his bed that night, and stealing out, with noiseless footsteps, to the staircase, listen for the slightest sound from the sick chamber! How often did a tremble shake his frame, and cold drops of terror start upon his brow, when a sudden trampling of feet caused him to fear that something too dreadful to think of had even then occurred! And what had been the fervency of all the prayers he had ever muttered, compared with those he poured forth now, in the agony and passion of his supplication for the life and health of the gentle creature who was tottering on the deep grave's verge? Oh, the suspense, the fearful, acute suspense, of standing idly by, while the life of one we dearly love is trembling in the balance! Oh, the racking thoughts that crowd upon the mind, and make the heart beat violently, and the breath come thick, by the force of the images they conjure up before it! The desperate anxiety to be doing something to relieve the pain or lessen the danger, which we have no power to alleviate! The sinking of soul and spirit, which the sad remembrance of our helplessness produces! What tortures can equal these? What reflections or endeavours can, in the full tide and fever of the time, allay them? Morning came, and the little cottage was lonely and still. People spoke in whispers. Anxious faces appeared at the gate from time to time. Women and children went away in tears. All the livelong day, and for hours after it had grown dark, Oliver paced softly up and down the garden, raising his eyes every instant to the sick chamber, and shuddering to see the darkened window, looking as if death lay stretched inside. Late that night, Mr. Losberne arrived. "It is hard," said the good doctor, turning away as he spoke. "So young, so much beloved, but there is very little hope." Another morning. The sun shone brightly, as brightly as if it looked upon no misery or care; and with every leaf and flower in full bloom about her, with life and health and sounds and sights of joy surrounding her on every side, the fair young creature lay, wasting fast. Oliver crept away to the old churchyard, and sitting down on one of the green mounds, wept and prayed for her in silence. There was such peace and beauty in the scene, so much of brightness and mirth in the sunny landscape, such blithesome music in the songs of the summer birds, such freedom in the rapid flight of the rook, careering overhead, so much of life and joyousness in all, that, when the boy raised his aching eyes, and looked about, the thought instinctively occurred to him that this was not a time for death; that Rose could surely never die, when humbler things were all so glad and gay; that graves were for cold and cheerless winter, not for sunlight and fragrance. He almost thought that shrouds were for the old and shrunken, and that they never wrapped the young and graceful form in their ghastly folds. A knell from the church bell broke harshly on these youthful thoughts. Another. Again. It was tolling for the funeral service. A group of humble mourners entered the gate, wearing white favours, for the corpse was young. They stood uncovered by a grave; and there was a mother once, among the weeping train. But the sun shone brightly, and the birds sang on. Oliver turned homeward, thinking on the many kindnesses he had received from the young lady, and wishing that the time could come again, that he might never cease showing her how grateful and attached he was. He had no cause for self-reproach on the score of neglect, or want of thought, for he had been devoted to her service; and yet 100 little occasions rose up before him, on which he fancied he might have been more zealous, and more earnest, and wished he had been. We need be careful how we deal with those about us, when every death carries to some small circle of survivors thoughts of so much omitted, and so little done, of so many things forgotten, and so many more which might have been repaired. There is no remorse so deep as that which is unavailing. If we would be spared its tortures, let us remember this in time. When he reached home, Mrs. Maylie was sitting in the little parlour. Oliver's heart sank at sight of her, for she had never left the bedside of her niece, and he trembled to think what change could have driven her away. He learnt that she had fallen into a deep sleep, from which she would waken either to recovery and life, or to bid them farewell, and die. They sat, listening, and afraid to speak, for hours. The untasted meal was removed, with looks which showed that their thoughts were elsewhere. They watched the sun as he sank lower and lower, and, at length, cast over sky and earth those brilliant hues which herald his departure. Their quick ears caught the sound of an approaching footstep. They both involuntarily darted to the door, as Mr. Losberne entered.
"What of Rose?"
cried the old lady.
"Tell me at once. I can bear it. Anything but suspense. Oh, tell me, in the name of Heaven!"
"You must compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm. My dear ma'am, pray."
"Let me go, in God's name. My dear child, she is dead. She is dying."
"No," cried the doctor, passionately. "As he is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come."
The lady fell upon her knees, and tried to fold her hands together; but the energy which had supported her so long, fled up to heaven with her first thanksgiving, and she sank into the friendly arms which were extended to receive her. Chapter 33